Was I expelled from Hogwarts? Hey! Look who's back for more adventures. We love having you here to continue this story that keeps us all awake. Important note, all of this is pure fiction. So don't try any techniques you hear here in real life, your neighbor might call the cops. This amazing novel and all its rights belong to the original author. We're just the ones giving it voice and drama. Are you enjoying the show? Prove it by subscribing to our YouTube channel and leaving that like that motivates us so much. And if you want VIP access to exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting with things you won't find anywhere else. Chapter 251 Ralph, who is good at deceiving young girls. The first-class cabin on the Mayflower was even more luxurious than Rove had imagined. Besides the private garden and the lavish house elves that were standard in every room, the bedroom was also tastefully decorated. A vibrant oil painting of a mermaid hung on the wall, her naked body posing in a captivatingly sexy pose. Opposite the painting was a large bed with rose-colored bedding, and the scent of lavender wafted through the air, elegant and alluring. The room also had a bathroom with a large jacuzzi, big enough to comfortably accommodate several people for a bath. Even a full-on Lotus-style scrubbing in the tub felt a bit too spacious. In addition to the extremely luxurious bedroom, the first-class public areas included a swimming pool, a mini Quidditch pitch, a coffee shop, and a private deck. After settling in, Rove strolled around the deck for a while. Unlike the crowded and noisy public deck, it offered a quiet respite from the sea breeze. The sun was about to sink below the horizon, turning the rose-colored waters a vibrant gold. The white railings were tinged with a pale red, making the entire ship look as if it had been repainted, giving it a serene and peaceful feel. The boy returned to his room, picked up some parchment, and wrote several letters, sending them to Sherry, Hermione, and Neville, informing them that he had boarded the ship and left. The quill pen scratched against the parchment. Grode, the botricle, sat on a bottle of squid ink, tilting his head back, gently swinging his legs, watching the blond boy intently and adorably. While writing to Sherry, Grode, with his tiny, rice-grain-sized eyes, scurried across the letter, using his ink-stained bamboo legs to step out an unreadable encrypted letter for the girl who had fed him for 2 years. There was a knock at the door. Ralph didn't move, but the botricle quickly stood up, hopping and skipping over to open the door. The boy turned to see Gabrielle, the little girl standing excitedly in the doorway, her arms still holding her sister's. Fleur, clearly dragged there, looked embarrassed. Speaking in French-accented English, she apologized. "Ralph, I told you you just arrived at the cabin and needed to rest, and asked Gabrielle to come later, but she insisted on coming to see you. I'm sorry, did I disturb you?" "No, please come in." Ralph smiled broadly, waving his quill pen. "You two sit for a while, I'll be right there." He had finished writing his letter. The last one was for Dumbledore, reminding him that Animagus could evade the influence of Dementors. In the original timeline, Sirius had escaped in this way, and Ralph didn't want Peter to repeat it, ultimately escaping Azkaban. That would completely shatter him. Of course, with Dumbledore's wisdom, knowing Peter was an illegal Animagus, he would certainly take precautions, but it's always better to be cautious. Fleur pulled Gabrielle into the room. Noticing the boy writing a letter, she wisely refrained from approaching, then quietly sat down on the sofa with the girl. But Gabrielle suddenly spotted the botricle hopping around. Being a child at heart, she broke free from Fleur's arm and chased after it. "Gabrielle, stop fooling around," Fleur scolded. "It's all right, Gabrielle can't catch Grode," came the boy's gentle voice. "Let it play with her for a while." Sure enough, the botricle was quick to dodge. Gabrielle ran wildly around the room, but never caught Grode, and was exhausted from its antics. The disgruntled girl caught her breath for a moment, then continued chasing the botricle around the room. Ralph finished writing his letter and stood up. The botricle jumped onto the boy's shoulder, straightened its back, put its hands on its hips, and giggled, looking at Gabrielle with a smug expression. Gabrielle ran to Ralph, looked up, pouted, and tugged at the boy's sleeve with a pitiful expression, wanting the botricle. Ralph tapped her forehead with his finger and chuckled. "No," the little girl said. "Oh." Ralph thought for a moment, then took out a seed and handed it to Gabrielle, smiling. "Take this home and plant it. Next summer, 7 botricles will grow, and they'll hang from a vine and call out to you." "Sister." Gabrielle turned to look at her sister, and Fleur, a translator devoid of emotion, quickly translated for her younger sister. However, the girl secretly thought to herself, what kind of seed can grow botricles? They're even lying to a child, but seeing Gabrielle's expectant gaze, Fleur ultimately didn't expose Ralph's lie. After hearing this, Gabrielle beamed with joy. I'll definitely plant it carefully and water it every day so it drinks its fill. Ralph chatted with Gabrielle for a while longer, explaining the key points of loosening the soil and fertilizing, all content covered in herbalism class, which Fleur could easily translate, and she even added some of her own insights. The girl hadn't yet figured out why Mrs. Maxim spoke so highly of Ralph. She decided to observe him more closely to see if the boy truly had any exceptional talents. Of course, because of Mrs. Maxim's evaluation and the fact that he had saved her sister, Fleur's impression of Ralph was still perfect for the time being. After chatting for a while, Fleur stood up. Ralph thought the two sisters were going home, but the girl hesitated for a moment and asked, Ralph, have you had dinner yet? Not yet. Why? My parents would like to invite you to dinner to thank you for saving Gabrielle, Fleur said somewhat shyly. Of course, if you don't want to, then maybe next time. Uncle and Aunt are too kind. Ralph didn't refuse and nodded. Then let's go. The three of them walked out of the room together. Fleur quietly lagged behind and deliberately asked, can that seed really grow into a botrytical? No, it can only grow into earbud flower. Ralph shook his head. Then why did you lie to her? Gabrielle hasn't given up after planting it for a while. That's hard to say. My sister isn't just a flash in the pan. Fleur raised her eyebrows. She can sit on the deck all day to catch a seagull. I can't outlast her. That's troublesome. Yes, Fleur smiled slightly. You'll have to figure out how to explain it to her next year. She's hard to appease. It's not me who's planning, it's you who's planning. Ralph joked, I'm not in France. If Gabrielle can't grow the botrytical, she'll come to you for an explanation. Fleur was dumbfounded. Yes, Ralph was in England. Would Gabrielle be pestering her every day? Fleur couldn't help but roll her eyes at Ralph, gaining a new understanding of him, like a heartless scoundrel, not as outstanding as Madame Maxim had described. Out of the corner of her eye, Gabrielle caught her sister and Ralph whispering to each other. Her big, bright eyes widened, and she quickly went over to ask, what are you two talking about? Your sister and I are having an in-depth discussion about the history of the Mayflower, Ralph casually explained. He likes to lie to little girls, and he can lie without batting an eye. In her mind, Fleur silently labeled Ralph and deducted 5 points. The girl sighed inwardly, hoping that Ralph would lose all his points on this trip. Oh dear, my computer isn't fixed yet, so typing is a bit slow. Chapter 2 will be at noon. Thanks to the generous donation from Just Love to Wonder in the Water. Chapter 252 Hibiscus, Luofu, so you're a pervert. Ralph casually mentioned the Mayflower, just to get rid of Gabrielle, but the little girl was unexpectedly interested, grabbing his arm and clamoring to hear more. Fleur smiled inwardly, thinking Ralph's lie was about to be exposed, but the boy remained calm and spoke eloquently. The Mayflower was originally a Muggle ship. In 1620, it carried a group of persecuted Puritans from Plymouth, and after arriving in North America, they established a colony there. After Fleur translated, Gabrielle asked, where is Plymouth? Fleur didn't translate the question for her sister, because it was too simple. She could answer it herself. The girl, with a hint of mischief and inquisitiveness, asked, Gabrielle is asking you what Puritans are. Puritans involved Muggle history, and Fleur, as a magic history enthusiast, had even looked up the term when learning about it, only to find it completely confusing. She didn't believe that Ralph, a pure-blood wizard, would know this. Ralph gave Fleur a deep look. He clearly heard Plymouth, so how did she translate it as Puritans? You're good at translation, the boy said. To understand the Puritans, you have to start with Christianity. The boy didn't expose the girl's lie. He cleared his throat and said slowly, back then, as the Roman Empire split into the Eastern and Western Roman Empires, the two dioceses went down different paths. The West gradually Germanized from Latin traditions, while the East became Hellenized. By the 11th century, they finally split into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. There were many reasons for this split, but frankly, it was a struggle for power. Each wanted to be the other's father, not just call the other father. The result was a fight, mutual excommunication, and then a complete separation. Along the corridor, the three passed a large grandfather clock. The white dial was inlaid with Roman numerals, and the two hands, one long and one short, stood out against the white background. Ralph paused for a moment, then continued softly, in the 16th century, another religious reformation arose within the Roman Catholic Church. This reformation originated in Germany, initiated by Father Martin Luther, and quickly spread throughout almost all of Europe. The catalyst for the Catholic Reformation was simple: the rampant corruption within the Church. In Christian doctrine, humans are born with original sin and need atonement throughout their lives. Jesus' crucifixion was seen as a way of atonement. Therefore, as long as one believed in Jesus, one could be redeemed and saved, and be called righteous by God at the Last Judgment. To achieve this atonement, indulgences were directly developed. They first appeared during the First Crusade, when Pope Urban II, in an effort to strengthen the religious faith of the Crusaders, declared that all those who joined the army could receive absolutions and indulgences. By the 16th century, indulgences had been abused, becoming a major means for the Church to amass wealth. What if the Pope wanted to build a luxurious cathedral but didn't have the money? He could sell indulgences. Of course, the Church couldn't use such a vulgar term as buying and selling. It had to be described as voluntary donation. For believers, atonement meant spending money. The more you spend, the stronger your faith, and the more the Lord would protect you. It had a distinctly Buddha saves the poor, but not the poor feel to it. To encourage the poor to donate, the Church would even have wealthy locals donate first, then split the profits 70-30 afterwards. It was all talk and no action, all business in their hearts. Martin Luther, to solve this problem, proposed justification by faith, meaning that as long as one sincerely believes in God, one can be saved. Ralph said calmly. Whether one follows church rules, buys indulgences, or completes expensive religious rites, none of that matters. While the churches were unhappy and excommunicated Martin Luther, ordinary believers were happy, since they truly had no money. Thus, Protestantism flourished in Europe like mushrooms after rain. Fleur forgot to translate for her sister, instead staring intently at Rove, urging, and then, Rove glanced at the girl, raising an eyebrow. Then, the Reformation caused a split in Catholicism, forming Protestantism, which in turn split into Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anglicanism. Among them, Anglicanism became the state religion of England. The Puritans, a branch of Calvinism, also spread in England, but were persecuted by the Anglican state religion. Fleur let out a long "oh," nodded slightly, and began to ponder silently. Gabrielle looked at her sister anxiously, tugging at her sleeve. "Why aren't you translating? What are you in for? I called you here to be a translator, not to chat with Rove." After hastily translating, Fleur looked at the boy again, puzzled, and asked, "They're all Protestants, so why would the Anglicans persecute the Puritans?" Ralph's clear, bright blue eyes shone as he stared at Fleur and asked, "Was this Gabrielle's question?" Fleur seemed a little embarrassed. She masked her unease with a faint smile, took a few steps, then turned back to Ralph and said, "It really was Gabrielle who asked." Ralph glanced out the window and shrugged, saying, "The Puritans in England demanded a further purge of the remaining Roman Catholic rituals within the Church of England. If the Church of England is the reformer of the Roman Catholic Church, then the Puritans are the reformer of the Church of England, the reformer among reformers. Such a sect would naturally be rejected by the slightly more conservative Church of England. When he was a reformer, he naturally disliked the conservatives, criticizing them for being unprogressive and stubborn. But after becoming the head of the Church of England, he began to resist the new reformers." "I see." Fleur couldn't help but admire him, silently adding points to the boy's impression of him. The three walked down the black, lacquered wooden staircase to the restaurant. At the corner of the staircase stood a marble statue, an ivory-white Greek goddess, more than a meter tall. Ralph glanced at the statue and continued, "Actually, the Puritan persecution was also closely related to wizards." "What connection?" Fleur couldn't help but ask. Seeing that Ralph was looking at her again, she blushed and simply said, "This is my question. With the advent of the Reformation, the persecution of wizards, especially witches, reached its peak." Ralph asked, "You've learned about this in the history of magic, haven't you?" Fleur felt like a student in front of this boy who was 2 years younger than her, which made the girl a little uncomfortable, but she still nodded and said, "Yes, I have. Both Catholics and Protestants persecuted witches, but the Puritans' persecution was particularly severe," Ralph said softly. "At that time, there was no ministry of magic. It was called the Magical Council. The wizards of the council, in alliance with King James I, turned around and persecuted the Puritans. In the end, the Puritans were forced to come to North America. On the Mayflower, there was a witch named Aesopthale who disguised herself as a Muggle boy and secretly boarded the ship." Ralph finally got to the point, and he smiled and said, "After Aesopthale came to North America, she settled down and eventually became the founder of Ifemini Academy of Magic. To commemorate this event, The Magical Congress of the United States later bought the Mayflower and converted it into a magical ship for shipping between Europe and North America. Gabrielle tilted her head, looking at him with admiration. Wow, Ralph, you know so much? My sister doesn't know any of this. Fleur pursed her lips, ignoring the last sentence while translating. However, the girl still objectively gave the boy a knowledgeable and Muggle history assessment in her mind. After all, many pure-blood wizards weren't even knowledgeable in magical history, yet Ralph could speak about Muggle history so clearly. It was truly astonishing. Fleur was also very interested in history. Having finally met a peer with the same hobby, she asked curiously, Ralph, are you very interested in history? So, I only know a little bit, Ralph said modestly. I occasionally flip through history books in my spare time. Then what are you interested in? Fleur asked. A magical creature, huh? I'm actually a beast, cough cough, a healer. If you and Gabrielle get sick, you can come to me for treatment, and I'll give you both a discount. Ralph turned his head, sizing up the half-vessel sisters, and chuckled softly. Don't believe me? I've healed many students at Hogwarts. I'm famous for my miraculous healing skills. Fleur looked at the handsome, blonde boy, her feelings complicated, and silently deducted 10 points from his impression score. She hadn't expected him to be such a pervert, using treatment as an excuse to take advantage of girls. Chapter 253. Did the Mayflower hit an iceberg? Led by Fleur and Gabrielle, Ralph followed the stairs and through the corridors to a rose-colored dining room. A house elf stood at the entrance. Upon seeing the three, it immediately opened two opposing carved wooden doors and made a respectful gesture, inviting them into the hall. Ralph entered the room, looked around, and was filled with admiration. The Mayflower was only about 20 meters long, but this dining room was larger than a standard football field. The ceiling was a circular dome, made of white frosted glass with curved black borders, and a magnificent chandelier made of dozens of lights hung in the center. The walls were made of stained glass and murals, depicting metal birds and trees, beaded and embroidered underwater plants, and images of sea serpents and whales. The center of the hall was filled with guests from all over Europe, chatting in colorful robes. Many wizards and witches, whose names they did not know, were engaged in lively conversation, and the dining room was filled with laughter and joy. The house elves were also busy, with trays of cocktails floating in mid-air and landing in the hands of passengers. More than a restaurant, this place seemed to be a social hub for first-class wizards. Those who could stay here were generally wealthy and powerful, and eating was a secondary, insignificant attribute. Gabrielle's gaze swept through the crowd, and with her sharp eyes, she suddenly pointed into the distance and called out, "Over there!" Following the little girl's finger, the three walked over and came to a group of French wizards. Fleur introduced Ralph to a couple, saying, "Dad, this is Mr. Ralph Scamander. Ralph, these are my mom and dad, Mr. Scamander. Thank you for saving my daughter." "Thank you." Mr. Delacour excitedly extended his hand. Ralph shook his hand warmly and politely replied, "You're welcome." Mr. Delacour was a middle-aged man in his 40s, not very tall, stocky, with a pointed black mustache. Fleur and Gabrielle clearly didn't inherit Mr. Delacour's looks, which was wonderful. Beside Mr. Delacour stood a beautiful blonde woman in a purple robe. She was undoubtedly Fleur's mother. Mrs. Delacour was also in her 40s, but looked more like she was in her early 30s. Her appearance was practically a magnified version of Fleur's, possessing not only beauty and elegance but also a mature woman's aura that Fleur lacked. She warmly shook Ralph's hand, saying, "Child, do you know Mr. Newt Scamander?" "Madam, that's my grandfather," Ralph replied softly. "I knew it." Mrs. Delacour looked at the boy and smiled. "I've met your grandfather. He went to our forest and healed me, but I was young then, about the same age as Gabrielle. And you saved my daughter. How amazing." Fleur looked surprised. It was the first time her mother had mentioned this. The girl turned to look at Ralph. Was he just boasting about his healing abilities? Fleur felt her previous judgment might have been hasty. She decided to learn more about the boy. The Delacours chatted enthusiastically with Ralph, discussing Newt and Hogwarts at length. They even introduced him to the group of French wizards like a nephew. It wasn't exactly expanding their network, but at least they made him a familiar face. Many prominent French wizards were on this trip, including the Director of Transportation and the head of the Office of Magical Law at the French Ministry of Magic, and Sim Lestrange. The wealthiest wizard on the entire Mayflower, now 101 years old, vacationing in America with his wife, who was said to be 60 years younger than him. 20 years ago, rumors circulated that Lestrange was nearing the end of his life, 10 years ago, he was said to be unable to walk, but today, he was still alive. Not only was he alive, but Sin Lestrange had also impregnated his young wife, a true miracle of age and medicine. A young, handsome boy, almost too youthful to be real, also attracted the attention of many passionate and exuberant French women. Madame Russell was incredibly enthusiastic, touching Ralph's robes and seemingly looking down on Madame Malkin's handiwork. Madame Russell ran a lingerie shop in a hidden corner of Paris, specializing in bold and avant-garde sexy lingerie, and was quite famous in the French magical world. Madame Russell also whispered that she could design a suit for Ralph, hoping he could come to her room soon to take his measurements. There was also a painter, Madame Obadiah, who had come to the ship specifically to sketch, and upon seeing Ralph, she was immediately inspired. Ralph listened for a while before realizing she seemed to want to paint him a portrait similar to the one Jack painted for Rose in Titanic. Several witches, under the guise of drunkenness, tried to take advantage of Ralph, but the young man, being virtuous, always managed to evade them, like an eel swimming among dark seaweed and rocks. Of course, he also took the opportunity to expand his veterinary business. After chatting for a while, Ralph said goodbye and went to eat. Gabrielle followed him, and Fleur hesitated for a moment, worried about her sister, but had to go with her. The restaurant had many buffet tables laden with various foods. Spiced ham sat next to oddly colored salads, while golden roast suckling pig, roast turkey, Australian lobster, abalone in a special sauce, and steamed grouper were also on display. Champagne was served in glasses, along with various gins and spirits, as well as fruit wines with a relatively low alcohol content. Rove even spotted caviar. A house elf stood to Rove's left, carrying a large tray with small plates of dark brown caviar. "Sir, how would you like to eat the caviar?" the house elf asked, bowing slightly as Rove looked over, quietly awaiting his answer. Rove, of course, didn't suggest giving everyone a jar, because it was a buffet, and everyone could eat as much as they wanted. Gabrielle, taking advantage of her sister's inattention, secretly took a large sip of the fruit wine from Rove's hand, winking at him to keep it from Fleur. At 8 o'clock in the evening, an orchestra composed of fairies appeared. It wasn't a small band, but a full orchestra, complete with oboe, trombone, saxophone, violin, cornet, piccolo, bass drum, and soprano drum. The soft, melodious music filled the restaurant with a gentle atmosphere, which, combined with the clinking of cutlery and the lively conversations of the witches, transformed dinner into a grand banquet. Suddenly, the restaurant began to sway slightly, and the entire ship creaked. Gabrielle excitedly tugged at Rove's sleeve, shouting, "It's starting." "Look!" Fleur also looked around expectantly. Rove could feel the Mayflower slowly sinking towards the surface. As a magical ship, the Mayflower only surfaced during the day, sailing underwater at night. This was its most attractive feature to tourists. As the ship sank, its walls became transparent. Standing inside the restaurant, one could see the scenery outside through the magical glass. The waters around the ship, illuminated by lights, still displayed the blue of the sea, but as the ship passed, the blue vanished without a trace, leaving behind a deep, pitch-black abyss. They felt as if they were in an aquarium, able to see many fish. A pod of dolphins chased after the ship, attracted by its massive size, eager to challenge it. The Mayflower, bright as day, traversed the boundless seabed, ethereal and hazy, adding to the ship's mystique. But then, the entire ship began to shake. What was initially thought to be a technical adjustment grew increasingly violent, like an earthquake. Gabrielle looked up, curious, and asked, "Is this part of the planned program?" Fleur, sensing something was wrong, shook her head, bewildered. "Maybe the ship hid an iceberg," Ralph said slowly. Chapter 2, Evening. Chapter 254 Rove, I'm a magizoologist. Icebergs formed off the west coast of Greenland number approximately 16,000 each year, drifting away from their homes and appearing in the Atlantic Ocean. Many icebergs are so large that they can take up to a decade or more to completely melt. Therefore, the possibility of a ship colliding with an iceberg to replicate the Titanic's fate certainly exists, and the possibility is not low. Even in the 21st century, extreme cases of ships colliding with icebergs still occur. But the Mayflower certainly didn't collide with an iceberg. What ship would sway from side to side like a kitty right outside a supermarket? The magical glass windows still revealed the deep-sea scenery outside the ship. Looking up carefully, Rove saw a huge, thick, slippery body. That body twisted and coiled around the Mayflower, like a slowly writhing giant python, winding its way upwards. Fortunately, the Mayflower was protected by a layer of magic, so the hull wasn't broken in half, but the deck was still rocking violently, and the fully loaded sails were crackling loudly. Gabrielle suddenly pointed to a window and shouted. Ralph turned and saw a gigantic head staring at the Mayflower through the glass. The head wasn't a triangular or round snake's head, but a horse's head. On top of the horse's head were wart-like protrusions, and a pair of large fins protruded from its belly, resembling a whale. Ralph narrowed his eyes, staring at the magical creature, and whispered, "A cabro dragon, a cabro dragon." Fleur had never seen such a magical creature before, but she had heard of it, and asked with some surprise, "Aren't cabro dragons supposed to live in Canada? How come they were in the Atlantic?" Fleur was right. Cabro dragons were indeed magical creatures found in the waters near Canada, growing up to over 20 meters long, larger than many fire dragons. Its appearance was also strange: a horse's head, a snake's body, fins on its belly, and a whale-like tail fin, making it look like a plesiosaur. Besides the Loch Ness monster and the water monkey, the cabro dragon was the most famous aquatic magical creature in the Muggle world. Legends of this magical creature have circulated since the time of Native American tribes. By the 20th century, Muggle sightings became increasingly frequent, with even corpses being found, only to be quickly lost. The Canadian Ministry of Magic even established a special committee to handle these restless creatures. But a Canadian magical creature going to the Atlantic to attack a European wizarding ship bound for America, isn't that a bit too far-fetched? Suddenly, the Mayflower stopped, ceasing its journey. But this silence was brief, followed by a violent jolt, as if a cage had been lifted into the air and shaken rapidly back and forth. Ralph took out a seed and dropped it on the ground. After it sprouted, the boy quickly grabbed the sapling. Fleur and Gabrielle both stumbled, nearly falling forward. Ralph hooked his right foot around the trunk and caught one of the girls with each arm, preventing the sisters from falling. But the others weren't so lucky. Many fell to the ground, and the ceiling slabs crashed down with a crack, shattering into pieces. Fortunately, no one was hit, but it was still quite a close call. Fleur, gripping a branch, said palely, "Could the propeller blades have been entangled by the cabro dragon?" "No, they're probably frozen." Ralph thought for a moment and said, "The cabro dragon's magic can freeze seawater." His words were quickly confirmed. The temperature in the entire restaurant plummeted, making it feel like winter. The Mayflower hadn't hit the iceberg, but it had unexpectedly become a block of ice. So cold, Gabrielle rubbed her stiff arms, feeling icy cold. Ralph raised his wand, chanted a spell, and tapped Gabrielle's head. A puff of smoke rose from her body, instantly warming her up. At this moment, many wizards prepared to apprehend away. But it was actually difficult, because apprehend has distance limitations. Not all wizards can move over extremely long distances. They were currently in the deep Atlantic Ocean, far from both England and France. They might apprehend to the surface, where there was no land around, making it just as dangerous. Suddenly, a voice rang out throughout the restaurant, high-pitched and clear. "Don't panic, everyone. I am the captain of the Mayflower. We have magical megalodons on board, and they've been dispatched to deal with that cabro dragon. Many industries keep magical creatures. For example, Gringotts has fire dragons to protect its vaults. The Mayflower, a magical ship on long voyages, also keeps highly aggressive megalodons." A cheer erupted in the restaurant, but quickly subsided. 3 released megalodons attacked the cabro dragon. One was frozen solid, another had its body bitten off, its upper half severed, and it painfully plummeted into the sea. Finally, the megalodon simply fled in terror. They were only a little over 3 meters long. How could they possibly be a match for a 20-meter-long magical creature like the cabro dragon? The cabro dragon slowly chewed on the megalodon with its massive jaws, emitting chilling sounds, an action that intimidated all the passengers. Rove released the branch and walked along the sloping plank towards the outside. The boat rocked even more violently, making him stagger as if he were drunk. "Rove, where are you going?" Fleur called out. "If this continues, the boat will sink." "I'm going to lure that cabro dragon away," Rove said. "Are you crazy?" Fleur ran over and grabbed the boy's arm tightly, not letting him leave. "I'm going to find my mom and dad. I'll have them apprehend us. We can always escape." "Don't go and die." "What are you thinking?" "How could I go and die?" Rove turned around and said softly, "Fleur, don't worry. I'm much more afraid of dying than you are. I can run away if there's danger. Besides, I have a million ways to deal with it, trust me." Rove gave her his brightest smile. Fleur stared in astonishment into the boy's eyes. Beautiful eyes, she thought, full of calm. Fleur knew how to read a man's eyes, how to detect fear within them. The boy, however, was filled with determination and composure, showing no fear whatsoever. Fleur released his grip, and Ralph turned and strode forward, disappearing through the wooden door. "Sister, are you really all right?" Gabrielle whispered, nestled in Fleur's arms. "He'll definitely be fine," Fleur smiled softly. Inside the cockpit, Captain Carlos was persuading the sailors to take up their wands and attack the Cabro Dragon. "If you're willing to leave the Mayflower and attack the Cabro Dragon, I'll pay you triple your wages. If anything happens, there'll be a large sum of compensation, enough for the rest of your lives. Your children's living expenses and book fees until graduation from magic school will be fully covered by the Mayflower." Carlos waved his hand. "After graduation, your children will have priority to work on the Mayflower. It's a golden opportunity. Many wizards would kill for it." Hearing the last sentence, many wizards were reluctant to agree. They had worked so hard to create a better future for their children. The captain actually wanted their kids to work here after graduation. Is he even human? Just then, a boy carrying a black suitcase walked in. He smiled and said, "Since no one else wants to go, I'll go, but you'll have to pay me a year's salary." The captain looked at the blond boy and couldn't help but frown. "Who are you?" "I'm a magizoologist," Ralph grinned. "My name is Scamander." Chapter 255 The Battle Between the Horse-Shaped Water Monster and the Cabro Dragon. Captain Carlos, with 30 years of sailing experience, dreamed of serving 60 years, becoming the Mayflower's longest-serving captain, and retiring with honor. To achieve this, he couldn't afford any major accidents. His predecessor, however, had been misled by a muggle into modifying the ship into an electric vessel. Eventually, during one voyage, the electric boat's brakes failed, causing it to speed for several nautical miles, unable to stop, and colliding with several other ships. Carlos didn't want to follow in his footsteps, so his immediate priority was to drive away, or even kill, the Cadborosaurus. Of course, the captive megalodons were no match for the Cadborosaurus, and it wasn't entirely Carlos's fault. The Mayflower had been operating for centuries. The route was extremely well established. Who could have predicted the appearance of the Cadborosaurus? It's like a school being attacked by terrorists. You can't blame the security guard for not having heavy weaponry and drones. Unless you're American, there's really no need for that on a daily basis. Since the megalodon wasn't working, Carlos planned to send sailors out of the ship to attack the Cabro Dragon in the sea. He believed that a dozen well-trained wizards casting spells together would be enough to defeat it. Carlos had been to the dragon sanctuary and seen how dragon tamers train dragons. If dragons could be handled this way, there was no reason why the Cabro Dragon couldn't. But the sailors didn't think so. Their thinking was simple and straightforward. "We only make a few hundred galleons a month. Why risk our lives?" Carlos hadn't expected that the person ultimately willing to do the job would be a 13-year-old boy. Normally, Carlos would have considered the boy crazy, but after checking Rolf's Dragon Tamer certificate and repeatedly confirming his surname, Carlos immediately changed his mind, willing to try anything, even if it seemed hopeless. While the Cabro Dragon was different from a fire dragon, a 13-year-old boy obtaining a Dragon Tamer certificate at least showed he was indeed capable. Most importantly, it was that surname. Scamander, the name of Newt Scamander. Its prestige goes without saying, those who know. After much deliberation, Captain Carlos decided to include Ralph in the mission. It sounded absurd, but he had no choice but to gamble his career. Of course, he couldn't place all his hopes on Ralph. With such a hefty sum, several sailors were willing to venture out. Carlos also specially retrieved a pile of herbs from his collection, including gillsack grass, pickerel weed, and sea calamus. These herbs, when ingested, allowed the wizard to breathe underwater, but their effects varied. Gillsack grass would give the wizard gills and web feet, allowing them to move freely in the water like an aquatic creature. The downside was its unsightly appearance, resembling a large toad. Pickerel weed, also known as the mermaid herb, would temporarily give the wizard a fish tail, making them look like a mermaid. Wizards who enjoyed playing animal role-playing particularly loved this. It seemed the captain had offered up all his treasures. As for the sea calamus, after use, one can simply breathe underwater, moving slowly, but its advantage is that its appearance won't change. Ralph glanced at it and chose to take the sea calamus, while the others used gillstalk grass, so they could escape faster if trouble arose. Everyone walked towards a door, and as soon as Captain Carlos unscrewed the bolt, the door burst open, seawater rushing in. 3 sailors, with a boy in tow, jumped into the water, and the door was magically locked again. Ralph swam forward, taking a deep breath of seawater. He could feel the water flowing smoothly through his throat, delivering oxygen to his brain. The long, ridge-like cabro dragon slowly moved, glancing at the wizard appearing on the deck, and let out a roar. Instantly, a row of icicles formed in the water, like ice spears, clustering towards the wizard. The 3 sailors immediately waved their wands, casting the ironclad charm in front of them, attempting to block the icicle attack. However, the defensive capabilities of the ironclad charm varied. One of the icicles pierced through the charm directly, and instead of stopping there, it continued forward, shooting a hole through the sailor's shoulder. The terrifying penetrating force ripped the wizard away before he could even cast a second spell, pinning him to the deck. Gasping for breath, he screamed in French, "Help me! Help me! I can't go on." His heart-wrenching cries sent shivers down the spines of the wizards watching from inside the ship. "Fuck them, I knew the French were unreliable," Carlos cursed under his breath, his scalp tingling. He quickly opened the ship's door and rescued the sailor. There were only 3 sailors to begin with, and the other 2, seeing their teammate fall so easily, exchanged glances and quickly swam back. When they entered the cabin, Carlos hadn't even removed the icicle yet. 4 men had come out to fight Caberlong, but in the end, only Ralph remained. Facing the icicle attack, the boy didn't move, only waving his arms. The water-controlling magic brought by the horse-shaped water monster allowed him to easily summon water currents. The attacking icicles, swept away by the seawater, were blown about, swaying and tilting. Not only this one, but the next 5 or 6 were all deflected. Looking at the Cablo dragon, a sudden ding sounded in Ralph's mind. One wild Cablo dragon detected, triggering side quest 1, capture the Cablo dragon, reward magic, frost power, lowers the temperature of an object by consuming magic, thus applying a freezing effect. Side quest 2, complete 100% taming of the Cablo dragon, reward magic, ice body, the body can adapt to extreme cold weather like the Cablo dragon. Quest incomplete. Ralph glanced at the quest, frowning. Did this Cablo dragon not have a master? He had assumed it had a master who commanded it to attack the ship, but now it seemed otherwise. Enraged, the Cabro dragon coiled its body around the Mayflower, seemingly intent on dismembering it. The ship, protected by numerous magical spells, was faltering under such a powerful blow, like a weak city gate being relentlessly hammered by countless battering rams, shaking violently and teetering on the brink of collapse. The Cabro dragon rolled to the side, its massive form crushing a mast on the deck. Many wizards paled instantly. If the Mayflower were breached, seawater would flood the ship. They frantically waved their wands, using magic to reinforce the hull. Gabrielle, pale-faced, tugged at Fleur's sleeve, saying, "Sister, we won't die, will we?" Fleur, holding her wand and helping to reinforce the ship, glanced at the boy still on deck and softly reassured him, "No, we won't." However, the veins on the back of the girl's pale hands bulged, clearly indicating a lack of composure beneath her outward appearance. Everyone silently turned their gaze to the boy on the deck. He slowly swam towards the Cabro dragon, but instead of attacking, he tried to communicate with it. Cabro dragons were very docile magical creatures, rarely known to attack wizards. This extreme situation must mean something had happened. But the Cabro dragon raised its head high, opened its massive maw, and spat out a beam of emerald light at Rove. The surrounding seawater trembled, then quickly froze, spreading towards the boy. Since communication was impossible, other methods had to be used. As a magizoologist, knowing how to call for help was a basic skill. After all, you raise a beast for 1,000 days, but use it for 1. Rove knocked on the box, and the black leather case beside it, enveloped in bubbles, suddenly opened. "It's you." The horse-shaped water monster. The next moment, everyone's eyes widened in horror. A huge, half-ghostly magical creature leaped out of the box. Rove jumped onto the horse-shaped water monster, and without a word, pulled it back sharply. The horse-shaped water monster stopped abruptly, rearing up and neighing. In an instant, the seawater churned, and pulled by the horse-shaped sea monster, towering waves crashed against the spreading ice. Everyone craned their necks, gazing into the distance at the horse-shaped sea monster that had suddenly appeared, in battle against the Cabro Dragon. Chapter 256 Personnel List. Upon seeing the Kelpie, Cabro Dragon suddenly released its grip on the Mayflower. It raised its head and roared furiously at the creature. It was as if it had seen a long-lost nemesis. The two creatures had no personal grudge, but there was a deep-seated, ingrained enmity between the Kelpie and Cabro Dragon. Besides their water manipulation abilities, Kelpies could transform into many animals, their favorite forms being various magical sea serpents, in addition to horses. Various national ministries of magic had discovered numerous incidents of sea serpent attacks on Muggle ships, but after careful investigation, they found that many were the work of Kelpies. They liked to disguise themselves when committing evil deeds, especially the sea serpent disguise, which inadvertently garnered a lot of hatred towards sea serpents. Even more absurdly, many male Kelpies would deliberately transform into sea serpent forms during the sea serpent's mating season to mate with females. If the males were so wicked, the females were no less so. They dislike incubating eggs, secretly laying their offspring in the nests of female sea snakes, essentially usurping their nests, a veritable version of the cuckoo. After being hatched by the sea snakes, the baby horse-shaped sea monsters even know how to transform to protect themselves, and will even attack the baby sea snakes. Therefore, the sea snake's hatred for the horse-shaped sea monsters is truly ingrained. The Cablosaurus, also a type of sea snake, being the victim, immediately abandoned the Mayflower upon seeing the horse-shaped sea monster and rushed towards it, which is understandable. The horse-shaped sea monster is incredibly agile. It completely ignores the Cablosaurus's provocation, opening its mouth and swooping down, biting the Cablosaurus's body and pulling it down sharply. The Cablosaurus is not afraid at all. Its slender neck coils and twists like a python, tightly binding the horse-shaped sea monster. It also opens its mouth wide, exhaling puffs of snow-white breath. Starting with the horse-shaped sea monster, the surrounding sea begins to freeze at a visible speed. All the passengers on the Mayflower couldn't help but cheer loudly, hoping the horse-shaped sea monster would give them some strength, but it was quickly frozen into an ice sculpture, and even the boy seemed to be swallowed up. The wizards fell silent, feeling a chill wash over them. Fleur's eyes widened, her hands trembling uncontrollably as she held Gabrielle. But soon, the sea began to sway slightly, constantly crashing against the ice. With a series of muffled sounds, cracks as thick as wrists and as thin as earthworms appeared on the ice, spreading wildly to both sides. With a crack, the ice shattered, shards of ice scattering everywhere. After a brief moment of deathly silence, the passengers on the Mayflower suddenly erupted into a clamor like the sound of ocean waves. However, this clamor didn't last long before turning into terror. The seawater surged, and the Mayflower, like seaweed in a turbulent tide, was violently tossed about. It was as if blown away by a strong wind, instantly thrown away from the place where the two magical creatures were fighting. At this moment, the horse-shaped sea monster was once again locked in combat with a Cabro Dragon. The boy riding the monster took a deep breath, suddenly released its grip, leaped up, and swam swiftly forward, appearing atop the Cabro Dragon's head. The Cabro Dragon was tightly bound by the horse-shaped sea monster, unable to move, but its breath quickly froze the boy's body, leaving icicles and shards hanging from his face. But Rolf had already opened his eyes wide, meeting the Cabro Dragon's gaze. Petrifying gaze, the Cabro Dragon saw those eyes clearly, its pupils instantly becoming dull, its vision gradually blurring, its entire body stiffening like a frozen corpse. The sea serpent instantly plummeted, sinking heavily into the deep sea. A tattered magic ship floated on the sea surface, the moon rising, its reflection illuminating the 3 silver stars of Libra in the water. Captain Carlos stood on the deck, gazing into the distance. The sea was so calm, it was hard to believe that an attack had occurred so recently. Several small boats returned, carrying ferrymen who called out, "Captain Carlos, we haven't found the boy, then keep looking. Don't come back until you find him." "Yes, sir." The boats creaked and groaned as they sailed away. Carlos trembled as he lit his pipe with his wand, then sat down on the deck. It was dimly lit, with only the faint light from the cabins reflecting off the deck. Carlos sighed deeply. Although the events of the night had exhausted him, he couldn't sleep without finding the boy. The boy had saved the entire ship, he couldn't just disappear without a trace. Just then, a whooshing sound came from the sky. Carlos looked up sharply and saw a flying broomstick hurtling towards them. Carlos jumped to his feet, excitedly exclaiming, "Mr. Scamander, "You're back." Ralph hovered above the deck, controlling his broom, and grinned. "Yes, I looked for you for a while, thinking you just left. How could I? You saved the ship, how could I abandon you?" Carlos breathed a sigh of relief. "Are you alright?" "No." Ralph slowly descended, jumping onto the deck, and said softly, "But unfortunately, the horse-shaped sea monster and the cabro dragon perished together, sinking into the deep sea." Carlos narrowed his eyes, glancing at the box in the boy's hand. "I know you want to ask, why a horse-shaped sea monster appeared in my box, right?" Ralph's smile widened. "That can actually be explained." Carlos adopted a look of eager listening. "First of all, I'm a magizoologist, and I deal with many animals." Ralph cleared his throat and rambled on. "That horse-shaped sea monster, I found it in Romania and released it in England, but I didn't expect it to like me so much that it secretly followed me. As you know, horse-shaped sea monsters can transform into many animals. It turned into a cat and hid in my suitcase. I didn't notice it before boarding." Carlos was speechless. Ralph had said everything. Of course, he didn't want to pursue the matter of Ralph bringing a magical creature on board without permission. After all, without the boy, the situation tonight might have been much more serious. Carlos pretended not to know about this minor mistake. "It's just a horse-shaped sea monster, not a dragon. What's the big deal?" Carlos comforted himself. However, he was also planning to change his habit of not checking luggage in first class. To hell with privacy. Mr. Scamander, I think it's better to tell everyone that the horse-shaped sea monster is one of our ship's domesticated creatures. It'll be better for everyone, Carlos suggested. Ralph thought for a moment and nodded. "It's up to you." Carlos's suggestion was indeed excellent. It might avoid a lot of unnecessary trouble. Carlos smiled and took his leave, saying, "I have many matters to attend to. Please rest well, and just let me know if you need anything. I actually do have something I'd like to trouble you with." Ralph suddenly said, "I need information on all the passengers on this ship, including those in first class." "Sure," Carlos replied without hesitation, "whatever you want." The young man's actions tonight had earned him his respect and trust. "And what about command of the Mayflower?" Ralph joked. "That won't do. Command is my wife." Carlos laughed heartily. "When I retire, you can have some fun with her." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 257 Gabrielle, Ralph, my sister called your name in her dreams. The news of Ralph's safe return was relayed to all the passengers by Captain Carlos that very evening. Many wizards had been anxiously awaiting the news. To step forward in such a dangerous situation was already admirable, let alone the fact that he had genuinely saved the entire ship of wizards. This life-saving grace, even without expecting repayment, would at least fill most people with gratitude and hope for his safety. Therefore, upon hearing of the boy's return, most passengers finally breathed a sigh of relief. Having survived a harrowing night, the wizards were still enthusiastically discussing the previous night's events when they woke up the next day. Whether it was the battle between Cabro and the horse-like water monster, or Ralph's displayed bravery and strength beyond his years, these were all topics of conversation among the survivors. Regarding the whereabouts of the two magical creatures, Captain Carlos, following Ralph's account, confirmed, both perished, sunk into the sea. This ending left many wizards both relieved and disappointed, relieving that they were safe, but disappointed that no victor had emerged. The debate over whether the sea monster or the sea serpent is stronger is a perennial topic in the wizarding world, essentially akin to a Muggle lion versus tiger argument. Fans of both the sea monster and the sea serpent are practically ready to punch each other in the face. This was a rare opportunity, but unfortunately, it ended in a draw. Of course, there were also wizards who looked down on the sea monster and the sea serpent, claiming they could easily defeat them with a simple dog paddle, dodging attacks, raising their wands, and casting magic. However, before noon even arrived, that person was thrown into the sea by other passengers to dog paddle away. The argument between the horse-shaped sea monster and Cabro dragon remained the same for a while, so everyone turned to digging into the identity of the mysterious boy. Scamander is a very famous pure-blood wizarding surname, most notably Newt Scamander, whose books have been used as textbooks in almost every magic school. Therefore, Any wizard who has undergone a complete magical education is extremely familiar with this surname. Could the two be connected? Soon, British wizards saw Ralph's photo in the latest issue of the Daily Prophet. It was the front page headline, with Fudge, the Minister for Magic, standing beside Ralph, smiling broadly with his arm around the boy's shoulder. Below was the headline, the youngest Merlin Medal recipient. As they dug deeper, wizards unearthed a photograph from last summer's history, featuring famous wizards from various countries, still fresh in many people's minds. Everyone was in an uproar. No one expected such an ordinary-looking boy to have such a powerful background. Suddenly, even more wizards wanted to visit and express their gratitude, but Ralph had his house elves refuse them all, citing rest as the reason. He didn't have time for socializing. He focused his energy on the Caballo dragon. The supposed double demise was, of course, a fabricated story Ralph used to avoid trouble. The truth was, after the Caballo dragon petrified, he hid it in a box. Caberlong is still alive. A potent restorative potion made from mandrake will restore it to normal. At the end of the semester, Ralph had obtained a considerable amount of mature mandrake from Professor Sprout. The problem is, if he restores Caberlong now, it will undoubtedly fight the horse-shaped sea monster again. His small box is too small to withstand the destruction of two large magical creatures. Even if it doesn't return to normal, he needs to find a place to house Caberlong. At least he can't let the horse-shaped sea monster transform into a sea serpent and take the opportunity to act like a dragon rider. Even petrified, the horse-shaped sea monster still wants to do such a thing. It's quite despicable. No wonder Caberlong wants to kill it. Ralph stayed indoors for 2 days, basically busy with this matter, only briefly seeing Fleur and Gabriel when they visited before sending the sisters away. Ralph's prolonged absence fueled various rumors on the Mayflower, such as, Ralph hadn't returned at all, having died at sea, or he was seriously injured and bedridden. Many wizards demanded an explanation from Carlos, and with public opinion overwhelming him, Carlos, unable to afford to offend the powerful wizards in first class, had no choice but to approach Ralph. Carlos almost knelt at the door, begging Ralph to come out. His original annual salary was increased by an extra 6 months, plus free lifetime travel. Ralph finally reluctantly agreed. The young man appeared in the dining room at noon, and everyone cheered when he appeared. Ralph didn't stay long, hurriedly returning to his trunk, and didn't finish his work until the morning of the third day, appearing on deck for the first time. Early in the morning, there weren't many passengers on deck. Ralph stood alone at the railing, the white waves crashing below him, at least 20 meters above the water. The speeding Mayflower cut a white line through the water, like unzipping an invisible zipper, leaving a long white streak at the stern. Even after brief repairs, the Mayflower was in a sorry state. The three-masted ship had become two-masted, the deck was tattered, and many planks had fallen into the sea, beyond repair. A boy leaned on the railing, admiring the sunrise, when he suddenly turned and saw two girls standing a little further away. They were looking up at a flock of seagulls flying overhead, pointing and counting them. The younger girl had already counted to 24, but Ralph grinned and shouted, 44, 45. His deliberate interruption indeed led the little girl astray, making her lose track of where she was counting. Gabrielle, feeling annoyed, pouted and glared at him, but upon seeing his face, her eyes lit up with joy, and she ran over, dancing with glee. Gabrielle ran quickly to Rove, hugged his arm tightly, and laughed. Rove, what are you doing here? Rove raised his arm, but the little girl wouldn't let go, pulling him into the air. He laughed. I came to see the sunrise, and also wanted to try sea fishing. Fishermen can always find a spot anytime, anywhere. My sister and I came to see the sunrise too, Gabrielle said happily, her face beaming with a sunny smile. Fleur also came over, suppressing her excitement, and asked, Are you alright? I'm alright. Rove picked up Gabrielle, turned her around, and carried her on his back. The little girl was only 6 or 7 years old, not very tall. She rested her arms on Rove's head, her pointed chin on her arms, and smiled with her eyes narrowed. Gabrielle leaned close to Rove's ear, telling him about her experiences over the past 2 days, all the interesting and fun things she had seen and heard. Although Ralph was only slightly confused and didn't quite understand, he still chuckled and said, Wow, so many interesting things. This is so much fun, absolutely, it's incredibly interesting. Hibiscus watched this scene, blinked, and her mood suddenly improved, until she heard Gabrielle whisper, Rolf, my sister was talking in her sleep, calling your name. Chapter 258 Ghost Ship. Hearing Gabrielle babbling incoherently, Fleur, who had been eavesdropping, was initially stunned, then almost instinctively reached out to cover her sister's mouth. "Love, don't listen to her nonsense, she's still asleep," Love asked, puzzled. "What is Gabrielle saying? I didn't understand. Could you translate for her?" Fleur, somewhat embarrassed and annoyed, glared at the boy who had taken advantage of her. Could she repeat what Gabrielle had just said? But Love genuinely didn't understand. Gabrielle was speaking French, which he already only half understood, and now he understood even less. Damn, he'd definitely buy a comprehensive English-French dictionary after they got off the ship. Fleur gave the boy a deep look, and seeing that he didn't seem to be lying, she gently sighed and said in English, "Gabrielle said, she had a nightmare about you last night." Love was speechless. Dreaming about him was considered a nightmare? That's so embarrassing. Having managed to fool her off, Fleur gently tugged at Gabrielle's ear, her eyebrows furrowing, and said, "What nonsense were you talking about?" Seeing her usually doting sister react so strongly, Gabrielle unusually timidly spoke up, "Sister, I dreamt you were calling Rolf's name in your dream." Fleur was almost dizzy from the string of modifiers. After sorting through the sentences, she glared at her and said, "Then why didn't you finish what you said?" Saying only half of it could easily lead to misunderstandings. "Rolf's French isn't good, I was afraid he wouldn't understand," Gabrielle said understandingly, "so I omitted the unimportant part." That wasn't unimportant at all, it was the most important part. Fleur's chest ached with anger. She took a deep breath and barely managed to restrain herself from hitting her sister. "Actually," Gabrielle said weakly, "Sister, how do you know you don't talk in your sleep?" "I just know," Fleur said angrily. "If you talk nonsense again, I won't translate for you anymore." Gabrielle pouted. Fine, she wouldn't help. She'd been secretly learning English lately, so she could get rid of her sister later. Rolf's eyes grew increasingly confused, because the two sisters were chattering away, seemingly speaking the language of the villa, which he couldn't understand at all. It seemed that raising and taming a villa would have to be put on the agenda. Rolf ignored the two and quietly admired the sunrise over the sea. The sun slowly rose, and the sky seemed to have been deliberately painted with a brush. The rosy clouds on the horizon depicted every wave of the ocean as roses edged with gold. Rolf asked curiously, "Where are we now?" "Near the Bay of Biscay," Fleur explained while arguing with Gabrielle. "The Mayflower needs to dock at a nearby port." "I see," Rolf nodded slightly. The Bay of Biscay is located in the northeastern part of the North Atlantic, bordering France to the east and Spain to the south. It seems Carlos is planning to repair the Mayflower here. And indeed, it needs repair. It's quite far from America, and this little, dilapidated ship can't withstand any more turmoil. Rolf was momentarily lost in thought, and Fleur stopped arguing with Gabrielle, her eyes instead fixed on the box in the boy's hand. That night, she had witnessed the boy open the box, and the horse-shaped sea monster emerged. Captain Carlos claimed that the horse-shaped sea monster was kept by the Mayflower, transformed into a water rat, and had in the box, but Fleur was skeptical. She had seen Rolf many times. The boy almost always carried this box, practically never letting it out of his sight. Clearly, it was important. Rolf snapped out of his reverie and, seeing Fleur staring intently at his box, chuckled wryly. He handed it to her, saying with a smile, "Since you're curious, why don't you open it and take a look?" Fleur hesitated slightly. The girl knew this was somewhat impolite, her upbringing forbade her from doing such things. But curiosity compelled her, and she reached out and took the box. Fleur quickly opened it, then frowned. Inside were only some books and a change of clothes, nothing more. "You didn't think those two magical creatures were hidden in my box, did you?" Rolf chuckled. Fleur was full of suspicion. She carefully examined it but found nothing wrong. She glanced at the boy and said, "I'm overthinking it, but are they really dead?" "No, they aren't," Rolf readily admitted. "That cabro dragon was struck by magic, its entire body was petrified. I put it in a safe place." "What kind of magic could instantly petrify a cabro dragon?" A complex mix of emotions flashed across Fleur's delicate face, shock and confusion. At first, when she met Rolf, she was simply puzzled, wondering what it was about him that made Mrs. Maxim so full of praise. The night of the Cabertalian attack, she felt she had found the answer, courage. But today, the girl felt she couldn't see through Rolf anymore. He was becoming increasingly mysterious, which, of course, aroused Fleur's boundless curiosity. By the way, I looked it up in a book these past few days, and it says that Cabertalians are very docile magical creatures, Fleur said softly. That's right, Ralph nodded. Since it attacked a wizard, it means there might be something wrong with the Mayflower. Could it have been ordered by a wizard? Fleur guessed. That Cabertalian was a wild magical creature, not domesticated by a wizard, Ralph denied. How do you know? You have to trust the judgment of a magizoologist, Ralph grinned. Didn't you say you were a healer before? Fleur frowned. How did you become a magizoologist? Magizoologist and healer aren't mutually exclusive, they even complement each other, Ralph chuckled. It's like a teacher who is both virtuous and talented. Not only must they be technically skilled, but they also need excellent acting skills. In this respect, Bean falls far short. His acting is too awkward. Who do you think is suspicious? Fleur asked curiously. Most likely the wizards in first class, Ralph thought for a moment and said softly. First-class wizards don't have their luggage checked on the Mayflower. They might take advantage of this stop to disembark, Fleur reminded him. It's all right, Ralph said calmly. I've already spoken to Captain Carlos. All wizards disembarking will have their luggage strictly checked, including those in first class. Fleur fell silent. She felt that Ralph didn't seem like a 13-year-old boy at all. Instead, he was mature and thoughtful. Gabrielle, perched on Rove's back, suddenly pointed into the distance and asked, "What's that?" Rove and Fleur both looked up. A huge object was approaching the Mayflower through the morning mist. As it drew closer, its shape became clearer. It was a ship, but the hull was completely corroded, covered in rust, and the frame was exposed, as if it had been abandoned for a long time. Rove frowned and said, "A ghost ship, thanks to Joe Wren and Lynn Yellen for their generous donations." Chapter 259 9 Dragons Pulling the Coffin? Ghost ships are vessels believed to have disappeared or sunk, yet later discovered still adrift at sea. Both wizards and muggles have documented them. As early as Sumerian cuneiform tablets, it is mentioned that Upnabethan encountered a ferry without any human inhabitants in the Persian Gulf. He hid inside and thus escaped the Great Flood. Ancient Egyptian murals also depict ghost ships, and the ancient Greek wizard Odysseus spent 10 years adrift at sea after the Trojan War. There are numerous accounts of this. With the advent of the Age of Exploration, muggles recorded even more, the most famous being the Flying Dutchman. The most bizarre aspect of ghost ships is that the crew either all disappeared or became ghosts, forever bound to the ship. But these ghostly crew members have no consciousness, cannot tell anyone what happened to them, and simply mechanically repeat their work on the ship. The magic ministries of various countries had suspected the work of dark wizards, but all the ghost ships, aside from corrosion from seawater, showed virtually no serious damage to their hulls. If it were a deliberate attack, how could there be no trace of it, and the interior even remain as it was before the crew disappeared? Therefore, ghost ships are also known as ships of death, the most dreaded objects in maritime navigation. At this moment, the ghost ship drew closer and closer, and from the deck, Rove could see it more clearly. The entire ship seemed to have endured the ravages of time, severely corroded, and covered with various blue-green algae, barnacles, and other absorbent substances. Rove's gaze slowly moved upwards, seeing the empty deck, only a haphazard pile of rusty chains and iron plates. The sailors of the Mayflower also spotted the ship. They immediately issued warnings, urging the bridge to turn immediately to avoid contact. Having spent a long time at sea, the crew knew all too well the terror of ghost ships. But the ghost ship suddenly accelerated and rammed towards them recklessly. This ship, nearly falling apart and unmanned, was moving so fast, its propulsion system a mystery. The Mayflower couldn't avoid it. The railings on the decks of the two ships were pressed together like upper and lower lips. The Mayflower's steel figurehead shattered instantly, emitting a piercing scraping sound. Carlos appeared on the deck, staring blankly at the ghost ship, his emotions a complex mix of emotions, unspeakable suffering. Only a few days after setting sail, he had encountered a perilous situation unlike anything he'd faced in decades. He must have been cursed by death, dragging along a wizard he shouldn't have. With a jolt, the passengers rushed to the deck, trying to see what was happening. As if drawn by life, many ghosts suddenly emerged from the previously empty deck. Their faces were deathly pale, covered in decaying flesh, and covered in red hair, as if they had met with misfortune. The ghosts remained in their death poses, suggesting they had endured immense torment before their demise. There were also two little witches, about 6 or 7 years old, their dresses clinging to their bodies, their hair plastered to their deathly pale cheeks. They stood on the deck like choir girls, reciting verses, "Hear and remember, the cruelty of death, old or young, brave or coward, none can escape its scythe, its harvest knows no plea." Captain Carlos took a breath, drew his wand, pointed to his throat, and said, "Speak loudly." Then, his words thundered throughout the entire Mayflower. No one is allowed to board, even without his command. Few wizards dared to board that ghost ship laden with dead bodies and decaying sails. At Carlos's command, a group of sailors raised their wands and cast spells, attempting to cut the Mayflower and the ghost ship at their point of contact. With a series of friction, a deafening sound erupted from the ghost ship's hull, and a torrent of seawater cascaded down its edges, washing away the obscured name etched on its side, the Persephone. The Persephone, Fleur read it softly, then asked, "What does that mean?" Persephone was the eldest of the three sirens, a mermaid who fell in love with the ancient Greek wizard Odysseus, Ralph explained. After Odysseus's ship departed, Persephone jumped into the sea from her island, choosing suicide. Carlos, standing not far away, suddenly spoke up, "I recognize this ship." Ralph and Fleur both turned to look at Carlos. Gabrielle jumped down from behind the boy, struggling to stand on the railing, trying to observe the ghost ship up close. Carlos stared at the ship's name, his voice low. "I was only 15 then, an apprentice on a ship called the Golden Jackson with a boy named Kurga. Once, during a voyage, Kurga found an ancient nautical chart on his ship." Carlos paused, then continued. Ralph noticed the change in his mood and asked sharply, "What ship?" "A ghost ship," Carlos sighed. "We encountered a ghost ship when we were sailing. A few crew members made a bet on who dared to enter it. Kurga, young and impetuous, dared to climb in and return safely," Carlos whispered. "After returning, Kurga secretly told me that he found the ship deserted, yet intact and fully loaded. He found an ancient nautical chart on the table in the captain's cabin, marking a mysterious island that wasn't on any of our maps." Ralph suddenly remembered something, a thought flashing through his mind. "The Fountain of Good Fortune." Carlos looked at Ralph in surprise and nodded. "That's right, it's the island mentioned in the Bard Beetle's tales about the Fountain of Good Fortune." Ralph raised his eyebrows. He remembered the two-tailed mermaid Missala he had met in the Black Lake. She was searching for this island. Kulga later bought a ship and named it the Parserup. "That's the ship," Carlos continued. "He even invited me to be his first mate and go with him to find the Fountain of Good Fortune, but I didn't believe in those legends, so I declined. After that, the Parserup vanished without a trace," Carlos said sadly. "I thought it had encountered pirates or a storm, but I never imagined it had become a ghost ship." Ralph and Fleur exchanged a glance, especially the girl, whose eyes were full of doubt. Carlos shook his head. "I have to write to Mira. She'll probably be very sad." "Who is Mira?" Ralph asked curiously. "Kulga's wife." "Is Mira still waiting for her husband?" Fleur asked in surprise. "Oh, no," Carlos shook his head. "Mira married me the year after Kurga disappeared. She was 6 months pregnant then, and someone had to take care of her and the baby. I'm Kurga's best brother, so of course I had to do it." He'd only been missing for half a year, and he'd already gotten his best brother's widow pregnant? Wow. "So, is there really a Fountain of Good Fortune?" Hibiscus asked suspiciously. "Nonsense," Carlos shook his head. "Only children believe such childish rumors. What Fountain of Good Fortune? It's all bullshit, stupid gossip. Don't try to find these things. Believing in them will only lead to death. Those ships disappeared and became ghost ships because they were cursed. The curse of death." Gabrielle, standing on the railing, suddenly shouted, "Look!" "What's that?" Rob looked up and saw behind the ghost ship the skeleton of a fire dragon, pulling a coffin. 9 dragons, pulling a coffin. Chapter 260. Gabrielle is sick. A wooden coffin hung from the stern of the ghost ship, floating on the turbulent sea. The coffin was unmarked, except for a simple symbol on the lid, a triangular eye with a vertical line through the pupil. Rove squinted, staring intently at the symbol, instantly recognizing its meaning. The Deathly Hallows. With such a symbol on the coffin, could a saint seeking the Deathly Hallows lie inside? The boy's blue eyes narrowed, his face filled with curiosity, but he remained motionless, showing no intention of approaching to investigate. In the magical world, there's an ironclad rule: one can be curious about anything, but never touch anything one doesn't understand. It could easily lead to curse. Like Tom's diary, an uninformed wizard might initially think it's valuable, but as they open their heart to it, they fall into Tom's trap. Therefore, Rove would absolutely not approach the ghost ship, much less open the coffin. But not everyone is as cautious as the boy. The world is vast and full of wonders. Among so many wizards, there are bound to be a few fools. Do you think you live in paradise? This is the best illustration of that. After the initial fear, seeing that the ghost seemed to be making no move, some wizards couldn't wait any longer and prepared to climb aboard to explore. The crew of each ghost ship had disappeared suddenly, leaving most of their belongings behind. If no one had gone aboard before, they might now find many valuables. Gallon is so tempting. It's like a cartload of apples falling to the ground. Everyone knows it's illegal, but if one person takes a basket to pick them up, the other honest villagers might follow suit. Anyway, I picked them up. Seeing many wizards scrambling on the ghost ships, Carlos roared, "These idiots! Stop them from going up! Make them come back!" Carlos loudly commanded the sailors to stop the wizards, and the sailors cast spells, shooting red spells onto the ghost ships, slightly slowing the group's advance. Fleur walked side by side with the boy, gazing into the distance. She slowly asked, "Rolf, does the Fountain of Good Fortune really exist?" The girl had just asked this question, and Captain Carlos's answer was no, but she wanted to know Rolf's opinion. After all, when Carlos mentioned the mysterious island, Rolf immediately thought of the Fountain of Good Fortune. If it were just a fairy tale, he wouldn't have reacted this way. "Actually, I don't know either," Rolf said softly, leaning lazily against the railing, looking at the vast sea. "But I recently met a mermaid at Hogwarts. She was looking for the Fountain of Good Fortune, and her family has been searching for it too. I tend to think it's true." Rolf didn't believe Miss Sarah, but rather the bar beetle. "Mermaids?" Fleur asked, somewhat surprised. "Your school has mermaids?" "Yes," Rolf chuckled. "They live in the big lake next to the school." Fleur gripped the railing, blinked, and said, "I'll definitely go see Hogwarts sometime." "Sure, I'll be your guide," Rolf nodded. "But don't get your hopes up too high. The mermaids in the Black Lake are all ugly and have rather bad tempers." The boy recounted how he caught a mermaid 2 Christmases ago, was held a grudge for 2 years, and Lockhart ended up taking the blame. Fleur found it amusing and smiled. "Being the defense against the dark arts professor at your school must be really unlucky." "I think so too," Rolf laughed, a gust of wind ruffling his hair. Fleur's long silver hair was also ruffled by the wind. She tilted her head back, raised her eyebrows, and said, "It's getting windy." "Yes," the boy frowned, sensing something was wrong. Because it wasn't a gentle breeze, but a strong wind, and it was getting stronger and stronger, mixed with fine raindrops that stung their cheeks. But judging from the morning weather, it was supposed to be a bright and sunny day. Gabrielle, who was standing on the railing watching the ghost ship, suddenly rubbed her eyes. The perceptive Fleur squinted and quickly ran to the little girl, seeing her rubbing her eyes, which seemed a bit red and swollen. She crouched down and softly asked, "What's wrong?" Gabrielle shook her head and smiled. "Nothing, sister, it's just the wind." Fleur breathed a sigh of relief. Rolf looked into the distance. Suddenly, the sky was covered with dark clouds, and a few bright pink and gold clouds rolled like giant waves above the sea. "Let's go back, it's going to pour." Not long after Rolf, Fleur, and Gabrielle returned to their rooms, a torrential downpour indeed began. The dark clouds formed a curtain, covering the entire sky, making even daytime seem like night. Rolf actually loved rainy days, especially when he was alone in his room, listening to the fine, rapid raindrops pounding on the ship, creating a series of thumping sounds. It was a true auditory treat. But it wasn't without its downsides. The Mayflower couldn't move forward and had to drop anchor and rest until the rain stopped before continuing its journey. With the torrential rain, lightning, and thunder, the entire Mayflower swayed precariously, like a small boat adrift on a stormy sea, tossed and turned, making everyone feel incredibly insecure. This downpour was very strange, even Carlos couldn't explain it. He just wanted to get to America as quickly as possible. As for becoming the Mayflower's longest-serving captain, he'd set a small goal first, to survive. Fortunately, the ghost ship had also been blown away, which was a small consolation. Those daring wizards could no longer board the ship. Although the ghost ship was gone, everyone was in high spirits, spending the entire day gathered in the dining room, eagerly discussing the matter. As for the Cabro dragon, it seemed like something from the last century. No one talked about it anymore. Some wizards even took quite a few things out of the ghost ship. Captain Carlos objected to this, but he had no authority to confiscate them and could only let them be. Many passengers felt the trip was worthwhile. They hadn't expected to encounter the ghost ship after seeing the Cabro dragon. Ralph actually wanted to use the walker to infiltrate the animals, control them, and go investigate the coffin, but ultimately didn't. After all, the magical creatures he could control were all closely related to him, and he didn't want anything to happen to them. Ralph stopped thinking about it. That night, he leaned against the fireplace, listening to the downpour, a book in his hand. Just as he was preparing to take a bath and go to bed, there was a sudden, loud knocking on the door. Ralph frowned. He got up and opened the door, seeing Fleur. He asked, "What happened?" Fleur was pale and said anxiously, Gabrielle is sick. She's had a fever and is talking nonsense. Go and see her." Chapter 261 Dream Eater. Along a narrow corridor, Ralph walked briskly forward, with Fleur following behind the boy, recounting Gabrielle's situation. "She keeps talking in her sleep. When I was woken up, I thought she was having a nightmare and tried to wake her, but I couldn't wake her." Ralph was somewhat surprised. "Yes," Fleur said, her face pale. Gabrielle was covered in cold sweat. "I touched her forehead, it was burning hot, very abnormal. Dad went to see the ship's healer on the Mayflower, but he couldn't find anything wrong. He just prescribed some fever-reducing potions for Gabrielle, but they didn't help." Fleur's face was pale, her eyes red with fear and anxiety, and she suddenly burst into tears. "Mom and Dad don't know what to do, so I thought I'd come to you. You said you could heal." Ralph stopped and reached out to press Fleur's trembling shoulders, which were shaking from sobs. He said softly, "Don't worry, she'll be cured. Even if I can't, I can contact Dumbledore and have him transfer her to St. Mungo's Hospital for Magic. Gabrielle will be alright, I promise you. It's all my fault," the girl said, her eyes brimming with tears. "This morning when we were watching the ghost ship, Gabrielle was rubbing her eyes. I didn't pay attention. That must have been when the problem started. That's the ghost ship's problem, it has nothing to do with you." "I didn't notice anything unusual either," Ralph comforted her. "Don't blame yourself too much, you've done a great job as an older sister. Don't cry, if Mr. Delacour sees you, he'll think I'm bullying his precious daughter." Fleur looked up slightly, gazing at the boy's clear-eyed face, and softly hummed in agreement, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. The healer, Durek, examined Gabrielle again with a helpless expression, but despite taking the potion, her fever persisted, and he couldn't wake the little girl. He was at a loss. If it weren't for the captain's instructions, he would have already gone back. Durek walked out of the room, sweat beading on his forehead, and shook his head helplessly, saying, "Captain Carlos," arms crossed, said sternly, "Stop talking nonsense, think of another way, or I'll fire you." Carlos was helpless too. After all, the boy was Ralph's friend, and that boy had just saved his career. His friend was sick, and he had to cure him no matter what. "Even if it doesn't work, we have to try our best and not give up so easily. Don't make things difficult for him, let me take a look." Just then, a clear voice rang out from afar. Carlos turned around and saw Ralph carrying a box. He exclaimed in surprise, "You can heal." The old captain was genuinely astonished this time. Ralph had been influenced by Newt and had made research in the field of magical creatures at a young age, which he could understand, but to heal, even a genius should have some basic principles, right? "I know a little," Ralph said modestly. He did indeed know a little. He hadn't seen many difficult cases, but he could ask the portraits of the Scamander family in the box. These people were all masters. Sometimes, the system would give tasks based on the symptoms of magical creatures, and based on those hints, Ralph would know where to start. The young man strode into the room. Mrs. Delacour was holding a damp towel, wiping the sweat from Gabriel's forehead. Seeing Ralph come in, she made way for her husband. Mr. Delacour held his wife's hand, offering gentle comfort. His eldest daughter had said that Ralph could treat illnesses, and although he was skeptical, he had no choice but to try. Ralph sat by the bed, looking at Gabrielle, whose eyes were tightly closed. The girl seemed to be having a nightmare, her body trembled involuntarily with fear. Her fists were clenched, her body tense, and she screamed repeatedly. Ralph looked down at her pale face and gently touched Gabrielle's burning forehead with his finger. Suddenly, a ding sounded in his mind. A wild dream eater has been detected, triggering side quest 1, capture the dream eater, reward, memory surge, ability to use magic to construct an incredibly realistic false memory in the mind. Side quest 2, Complete 100% taming of the Dream Eater. Reward magic. Dream Siphon allows you to infiltrate the dreams of magical creatures like a Dream Eater, freely modifying the host's dreams, or replacing the host's dreams with the images constructed by memory search. Ralph narrowed his eyes and said softly, "There's a Dream Eater inside Gabriel." A Dream Eater? The wizards present all looked doubtful. They had never heard of such a magical creature. Dream Eaters are rare in Europe. They are a rare magical creature from East Asia, Ralph explained. They can infiltrate human dreams, freely modify their content, and then feed on human nightmares. The Dream Eater is a non-existent dark creature. The term non-existent refers to a type of magical creature. They transcend life and death, neither born nor dying, but are created by human emotions and feed on these emotions. The most famous non-existent creatures are boggarts and dementors. Can it be cured? Mr. Delacour asked hurriedly. It's not that difficult, but it's not that easy either, Ralph said, looking up. Dream Eaters feed on nightmares, and you can banish them using positive emotional power. What is positive emotional power? Fleur asked. The Patronus charm is a positive emotion. It can banish the Dream Eater from Gabrielle's dreams. Ralph looked around and asked, "Who among you knows this spell?" The Patronus charm is an extremely complex and difficult spell to cast. Not all wizards know how to use it. I do. Mr. Delacour raised his wand and shouted, "Patronus charm." A dazzling silver creature emerged from the tip of his wand, a large bird. It circled the room once, then flew towards Gabrielle, passing through the girl's body. Suddenly, white mist enveloped Gabrielle, as if she were wrapped in an invisible cocoon. Wisps of black smoke were driven out of the girl's body by the white mist. It was a black magical creature with an elephant trunk, sparse bristles covering its body, and long, stiff mane along its back. The dream-eating beast cackled and ran, suddenly burrowing into Rolf's body. Rolf closed his eyes, feeling himself slowly drifting off to sleep. A graceful figure appeared in his mind, writhing beside him. In an instant, the naked girl's face revealed a face Rolf knew all too well. The boy stared at her, wide-eyed. The girl began to circle around Rolf, swaying and drifting, her lips not moving, yet her sweet, melodious voice lingered in his ear, utterly captivating. "Let me go. I can grant you any wish in your dreams. I can let you be with any girl. Whatever you want, you can have it all. Come on, little brother." Soon, even the wizards ensnared by the dream-devouring monster were finding it hard to resist. Who could withstand such a test? Chapter 262 The Ghost Ship's Ghost Map. As a peculiar magical creature, the dream-creating dream of the Baku was remarkably realistic. At least, even though Ralph knew it was fake, he never sensed anything amiss, only feeling as if he were in a truly real environment. Of course, if there was anything unusual, it was that the Baku, using the boy's memories, conjured Sherry, a mere replica of her appearance, devoid of any soul. Therefore, even if you were to accidentally fall under the Baku's spell one day, Ralph, with his understanding of ponytail girls, could immediately distinguish the real from the fake. Ralph didn't know the Patronus charm and couldn't banish the Baku, but his dream didn't last long. The boy felt a warm, silvery light enveloping him. But to the Baku, it was as blinding as being exposed to direct sunlight. It was intensely burned by Mr. Delacour's Patronus. The alluring laughter ceased in Ralph's ears, replaced by sobs, and Sherry's figure vanished. Ralph opened his eyes again. He was back in the room. The dream beast had been knocked down. It curled up and lay limp on the ground. Ralph walked over, grabbed the dream beast by the neck, opened the box, and locked it inside. Capture complete. Gabrielle, who had been in a deep sleep for a long time, suddenly woke up and sat up. She seemed to have had a long nightmare. She wiped the sweat from her forehead, still a little dazed. Fleur rushed over and hugged Gabrielle tightly, crying. The little girl was held tightly, her two slender arms flailing in the air. She asked with a confused look, "Sister, what's wrong?" "Rolf, what are you doing here?" "Your sister said, you were talking in your sleep and calling my name, so she came to listen," Rolf joked. "Huh?" Gabrielle looked shocked. "Really? I think I had a nightmare. Was it because I dreamt about you? Since everything's alright, I'll head back now." Rolf picked up his suitcase, winked at Gabrielle, and smiled. "Good night." The Delacour couple hurried out to see the boy off, their eyes filled with gratitude. After they parted ways, Captain Carlos looked at Ralph and said with a sigh, "Ralph, I used to have a lot of prejudice against Hogwarts. I thought it was no good, ranked last in educational assessments, with people dying every year, just relying on Dumbledore's name to get funding, and as corrupt and decadent as England, Ralph thought Carlos would change his tune after a few words. After all, this was a common tactic of praising by first criticizing, but he never expected. He remained pessimistic for more than 10 minutes before praising, but, now I think Hogwarts might not be as bad as the rumors say. After all, it can produce such an excellent student as you. What, are you thinking of transferring your child to Hogwarts? Ralph asked curiously. Then forget it, I'll just be polite. Carlos clicked his tongue. I wouldn't let my granddaughter go to such a terrible magic school as Hogwarts. Have you considered applying for the Defense Against the Dark Arts professor position at Hogwarts after you retire? Ralph invited kindly. This position is permanent, with summer and Christmas holidays, unlike your job of sailing every day, spending months at sea. Stable, you kid, I want to live a few more years, Carlos chuckled. The position was indeed stable. After a year, he could stay in his coffin forever, never to move again. By the way, what do you think of that dream-eating beast? It must have come from that ghost ship. Ralph thought for a moment and said. I think so too, Carlos sighed. I'm very worried about the safety of those passengers who took the ghost ship's items. As far as I know, most wizards who possess undead items for a long time died unnatural deaths, like the curse of the ghost ship. Ralph listened quietly without replying. So for the safety of those passengers, I've taken back everything they took, intending to throw it back into the sea. Of course, to avoid the curse, I had the house elves take it. They were willing to give it away for free. Ralph looked surprised. If they were, they wouldn't have risked boarding the ghost ship in the first place. Of course not for free, Carlos sighed. I told them about the curse beforehand, and those willing to pay for it mostly kept cheap trinkets. Of course, some people took valuable items and didn't want to sell, and I didn't force them, but that's still a galleon. Ralph stared at Carlos. You're so generous. Of course I have my own reasons. Those people are still on the ship, and I'm afraid they might really be cursed and die on board, affecting my resume. Carlos wanted to become the longest-serving captain and didn't want them to actually die. Besides, the Mayflower is so badly damaged, I can just get extra reimbursement for repairs. I won't have to spend any money. Hey, being a captain really is an art, Rove chuckled. When we dock, I'd like to buy some big-ticket items. Will you reimburse me? My granddaughter isn't much older than you. If you'd like to be with her, I could reimburse you. Carlos laughed. Rove exclaimed, glanced at Carlos's face, and shook his head. I'd rather not. The thought of someone looking exactly like Carlos was terrifying. Carlos knew what Ralph was thinking, and he chuckled, jokingly scolding, my granddaughter is stunningly beautiful. If you miss this ship, you'll never have another chance. Ralph thought for a moment, then suddenly asked, among those items, is there the nautical chart marked with a mysterious island? I knew you'd be interested in that chart. Carlos sighed softly. Let's get this straight, child. I don't want you to take that chart and go looking for some mysterious island. You saw what happened to Kurga. I won't go, but I have a friend who's looking for that island. I won't take the original chart. I can use magic to make a copy and give it to her, Ralph assured him. Miss Sarah was cursed with grayscale and had been searching for the fountain of good fortune. That chart would definitely help her. Of course, the reason Ralph was so eager was because Dumbledore had told him that Gryffindor had visited the mermaid tribe. If he could use the chart to gather information, that would be ideal. Led by Carlos, the two walked down the corridor and entered the captain's cabin. It was a large room, the walls adorned with portraits of the Mayflower's former captains, all possessing extensive naval experience and capable of advising the current captain in crucial moments. In a corner, a cabinet held room and various exquisite sculptures. Rove strode to a large table laden with items taken from the ghost ship, ready to be thrown back into the sea. Just as Carlos had said, there weren't many valuable items. Rove's gaze was quickly drawn to a notebook, a nautical logbook, its brown leather slightly cracked from age. Beside the logbook was a parchment nautical map, depicting various exquisitely detailed and terrifying magical sea creatures, seemingly about to roar out of the map. Chapter 263 The Mysterious Circus. Rove took a nautical chart and a logbook from Carlos, but not the originals, only copies made with a copying spell. Rove dared not take the originals. After all, Captain Carlos had spoken with absolute certainty, and he too feared being afflicted by the ghost ship's curse. In the magical world, one couldn't disregard superstition, Those defense against the dark arts professors who had bravely faced adversity had ultimately fallen victim to Tom's curse because of their stubbornness, a stark reminder of the danger. Carlos even threw the ghost ship's belongings back into the sea in front of the boy. As if to prove his words, the storm stopped the next day, just that eerie. Now that the sky had cleared, the rain had stopped, and the sun had emerged from the clouds, the Mayflower set sail again for the port of Bilbao. Bilbao, located in northern Spain, on the southeastern side of the Bay of Biscay, is a bustling port city. Besides the athletic Bilbao Football Club in La Liga, it's probably most famous for the Guggenheim Museum. The Guggenheim Museum is one of the world's most famous private modern art museums and a global chain of art venues. Besides New York, it has branches in Bilbao, Spain, Venice, Italy, and Berlin, Germany. Rolf had read about this museum in his high school English textbook in his previous life, and it left a deep impression on him. Of course, at this point in time, the Bilbao branch hadn't been built yet. The Mayflower finally docked at a wizard's shipyard for deck repairs, giving the passengers a whole day to enjoy. Rolf initially wanted to stay in his room studying the nautical charts, but was dragged away by the Fleur sisters to go with him to Bilbao for sightseeing. Rolf had saved Gabrielle twice, and the Delikers were extremely grateful to him, treating him like their own son. Not only did he get free food, drinks, and entertainment, but Fleur even carried his suitcase to keep his arms from getting tired, a scene that stunned a young girl. She had never received such treatment in her life. While shopping, Rolf glanced at a distinctive Spanish-style flying broomstick, and Mr. Deliker immediately wanted to buy it, only to be hurriedly stopped by the boy. "We're not rich kids like Black," he said. "We can't just throw money around like that." Mrs. Deliker also took Rolf to a clothing store, saying that boys shouldn't dress so plainly, they should be raised in luxury. Seeing that Rolf seemed to like Quidditch, Mr. Deliker even bought tickets and took everyone to see a Spanish Quidditch Cup match. But the result was shocking, a complete upset. The professional athletic Bilbao Quidditch team, playing at home, was eliminated by an amateur Quidditch team, stopping short of the round of 32. They were utterly shameless. But this was understandable, considering the Spanish Quidditch team didn't even qualify for next year's Quidditch World Cup in England. The good news is that although the national team didn't qualify, they reportedly have a lot of sponsorships, which is a kind of participation in itself. As evening fell, they returned to the Mayflower. The deck had been repaired, the broken mast replaced, and the defensive magic reinforced. Captain Carlos was overjoyed. His wife, ravaged by the Cabro dragon, had now undergone a repair surgery, and was clean again. Carlos, along with a group of crew, stood on the Salvi Bridge and prayed to death to leave their Mayflower alone. This was a Bilbao custom. Sailors crossing the Nervion River would pray for a safe return. The bridge's name, Salvi, literally means peace be upon you in Spanish. Carlos also bought a large quantity of Atlantic salmon from the fish market and had the sailors release them into the Nervion River. Salmon, also known as salmon, is a deep-sea fish anadromous, spawning in freshwater rivers and streams before returning to the ocean to fatten up. Therefore, releasing sea fish into the river wasn't a problem. However, Carlos's insistence on the idea of accumulating good karma through releasing fish made Rove chuckle. He wasn't so particular, especially seeing those half-meter-long salmon, shimmering red in the sunlight, leaping out of the water one after another. Rove's mouth watered. If he didn't fish for them, he wouldn't deserve to be called a fisherman. So, Rove, along with Fleur and Gabrielle, sat down by the river to fish. Carlos released the fish, while the three of them caught them. Fleur was a little reserved, somewhat embarrassed by their shamelessness, but Gabrielle was having a blast, gripping the net tightly and constantly scooping up fish. She had recently been learning to fish from Rove, but even with the same rod, hook, line, and bait, she couldn't catch any sea fish. Sometimes she would spend an entire afternoon without a single catch. Meanwhile, Rove's basket was overflowing with fish. Gabrielle had always dreamed of catching fish one day. Now, with her net in hand, she had already caught 7 or 8 large fish, her little face beaming with happiness. Carlos turned and saw this, and was furious. He rushed off the bridge, angrily shouting, "Hey, you did this on purpose, didn't you? You do your good deeds, I'll fish, we don't conflict," Rolf said with a chuckle. "Otherwise, you can spend more money to buy them from me and release them. I definitely won't fish." "But I really didn't expect you to believe in this," Rolf asked, somewhat puzzled. You don't understand, do you? Let me teach you a lesson, kid. Carlos sat down next to Ralph and whispered, when it comes to releasing fish, whether you release a few more or a few less, it doesn't matter. The number can't be checked, but you can report more when you're in debt. Saying that, you'll probably lose 10 years worth of good deeds. Suddenly, Rove grabbed the fishing rod and pulled back hard. He felt the hooked salmon throb in the water. He then swung it forcefully, dropping the fish onto the ground. The salmon lay there, looking robust in the sunlight, its streamlined body resembling a bullet. Its eyes were large and vacant, its tail thrashing rapidly against the deck, releasing its last burst of energy. Carlos, out of kindness, smacked the fish on the head, then kicked it into the basket. Rove, let me tell you. I also bought an expensive shark. Come to my room tonight. Want to try some? Carlos said with a grin. Rove raised an eyebrow, nodded, and smiled. By the way, did you check the luggage of the passengers who disembarked? They were all thoroughly checked, basically no problems, Carlos said in a low voice. He knew Rove was still investigating the cause of the Kaburo dragon's loss of control, which was one of the things he admired most about the boy, bravery and boldness, yet also caution and prudence. There's something I need to tell you, Carlos reminded him. A special passenger boarded the Mayflower today. Ralph raised an eyebrow. What passenger? A mysterious circus. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 264 The Mermaid Performance Tomorrow. Carlos invited Ralph to try some shark meat, and the boy readily accepted. But he quickly regretted it. The worst food Ralph had ever eaten, besides the famous British dish stargazing, was Hagrid's rock crust. But those two dishes were actually alright in appearance, you only knew how awful they were once you tasted them. The shark meat Carlos prepared was different. As soon as it was served, Ralph stared at the pale, sealed glass jar of shark meat, and just one look was enough to kill his appetite. Even now, he hadn't realized the seriousness of the situation. Staring at the glass dome, he even wondered if it was a special method to preserve the aroma. But as Carlos opened the jar, Ralph finally understood why it was sealed, because it stank. The smell, if you had to describe it, was roughly like the pungent odor of urine and vomit mixed together in a garbage can on a hot summer day. Merlin's generous gift crab, Ralph was nearly suffocating. He covered his nose and said, "What did you put in it?" "Nothing, just shark meat." But Carlos took a deep breath of the stench and laughed. "This is the Icelandic way. The Icelandic way. It's burying the shark meat underground and fermenting it for a few months. The shark meat develops texture and emits an ammonia smell, then it's ready to eat. Of course, we have magic, so we don't need to go through all that trouble," Carlos said with a look of enjoyment. "It only takes a few hours to ferment." "Is this stuff edible?" Ralph frowned. "Ralph, it seems you've never tasted shark meat before," Carlos laughed. "Sharks don't have kidneys, so uric acid accumulates in their bodies, making their meat poisonous. If you eat it fresh, it will cause problems. Fermentation is the best way to detoxify shark meat." Ralph curled his lip, looking disgusted. "Give it a try," Carlos urged. "This is my favorite food. Every time I sail the Mayflower through Reykjavik, I have a feast." Carlos scooped up a piece of shark meat with a spoon, dipped it in wasabi, and chewed it slowly, a satisfied smile spreading across his face. Ralph hesitated. Could it really be that good? "Try it." Carlos grabbed the bottle of rum, gulped it down, wiped his mouth, and urged, "Don't worry, it smells bad, but it tastes good." Ralph thought of the stinky tofu and snail rice noodles from his hometown. He believed him, forked a piece of shark meat, and put it in his mouth. He vomited. The pungent and choking smell instantly assaulted Rob's throat. It was like something pulled from the toilet, utterly stinky, and the moment it entered his mouth, he wanted to crush his taste buds. "I'm going to the restaurant," Rob said, spitting the shark meat into the trash can and standing up. "If I go back now, I can still make it for dinner." "Don't go. If you don't like this, there's other food," Carlos quickly said. Soon, a house elf brought out a rich oyster soup, followed by herring and roasted turkey with corn pies. Once the food was ready, Rove sat down again, using magic to mask his smells, and began to eat. Carlos and Rove chatted about their adventures at sea, and of course, he didn't forget to promote his granddaughter who was studying at Ifamoni. As dinner ended and the tablecloth was removed, Carlos picked up a cigar, held the flame close to the end, and turned the match to evenly heat the cigar, letting it burn from the edges to the center. Rove leaned back in his chair, stretching comfortably towards the fireplace behind him, and said, "So, what brings you here tonight?" Carlos's invitation to dinner was clearly not just for casual conversation, there was something else going on. "I'm worried that you're young and hot-blooded, and might not like the mysterious circus, and get into a conflict with them." Carlos puffed on his cigar, the fragrant, rich blue-gray smoke swirling in the air. Ralph remained silent. He'd heard Newt mention the mysterious circus. It was a Scamander family business. Like the Scamanders, this family collected various magical creatures, but unlike Newt, who did it to protect and preserve endangered species, the Scamanders did it for money. They tamed magical animals, performed them around the world, and even staged freak shows for entertainment. What were freak shows? Two-headed and three-headed magical creatures were commonplace. They also had various hybrids of humans and other magical creatures, half-elf, half-giant, muggle beasts, all pitiful creatures rejected by society. Nagini, tormented by the blood curse, had been captured by the mysterious circus and used as an actor. "Carlos, you overestimate me," Ralph suddenly chuckled and said softly, "I'm just a small-time wizard. I don't have the ability to get into conflict with a circus." "Ralph, don't say that." Carlos took the lit cigar out of his mouth and shook his head. "I know you're very capable. I knew it when you went to deal with Caberlong at night, but I'm still worried you'll get hurt." "Don't worry, I don't meddle in other people's business," Ralph said calmly. Carlos took a breath, his gray eyebrows drooping low. He sighed. "That's good." Everyone knew that the mysterious circus engaged in abusive practices for the sake of performances, and even the origins of those deformed creatures were questionable. Scamander and Scamander both dealt with magical creatures, and Carlos didn't want a conflict between them. He didn't want to offend Scamander, and even less did he want to offend Scamander, especially this genius young man with a bright future. After leaving the room, Ralph found that there were no wizards in first class, but at this time, dinner should have already ended. The boy thought for a moment, then headed towards the restaurant. Before he even arrived, he heard deafening cheers. A house elf standing at the entrance immediately opened the two facing carved wooden doors upon seeing Ralph. Ralph entered the restaurant, looked around, and found that the tables had been removed, and everyone was gathered around watching the performance. Music, laughter, and conversation filled the room. The circus performance was at its climax. A banner read, "Mysterious Circus, Monsters and Eccentrics." A half-human giant stood on a balance beam, performing a series of clumsy tumbling maneuvers. Despite its clumsiness, it never fell. This contrast earned cheers and applause from the audience. Half-elf walked around, holding a hat, asking the audience for money. A middle-aged wizard shouted, "Tomorrow's performance, The Mermaid." Ralph suddenly looked up. Chapter 265 Persuading with Reason, Scamander. When Ralph found Fleur and Gabrielle, the performance of the mysterious circus was nearing its end. The seemingly clumsy half-troll had performed a gymnastic routine on the pommel horse, first a 180-degree inverted spin, then a 90-degree Thomas twist, like a nimble fat man. The half-troll, true to its name, a hybrid of wizard and troll, it resembled a troll but wasn't quite as ugly. While not as intelligent as a wizard, it was significantly more intelligent than a troll, which allowed it to be trained to be so obedient. However, during its uneven bars performance, the half-troll finally made a mistake. It didn't hold on to the bars properly, lost its balance, and tumbled headfirst to the ground with a thud. Many spectators jeered, "Refund! Refund!" Scamander forced a smile, raised his wand high as if wielding a whip, and struck the half-troll's face, urging him to stop playing dead and get up. The troll rolled on the ground, howling in pain, breaking the railing. Perhaps accidentally, or perhaps for the sake of the show, it smashed directly onto Scamander's head. The wizards laughed even harder at this comical scene, but the troll received a more severe beating. Gabrielle couldn't laugh. The little girl tugged at Fleur's sleeve, her face contorted with worry. "Sister, so pitiful." Fleur felt a pang of pity at the sight, but there was nothing she could do. After all, it was a magical creature from the circus. After the troll thrashed around for a while, Scamander finally announced the end of the show. But most of the audience were still eager for more, refusing to let him leave and even throwing Gallon toward the stage. Scamander smiled. This was the effect he wanted. He quickly opened another cage, and an orc crawled out. She wore a felt hat, had a scarred witch's face, and 6 arms that could extend and retract at will, making her look like Spider-Man. Next, please enjoy, Scamander shouted, Black Widow vs. Catwoman. A house elf pushed out a large spinning wheel, on which was strapped a Catwoman, her entire body covered in long fur, except for her womanly face. Apples were tied to the Catwoman's chest, mouth, arms, and ankles. The house elf spun the wheel, and Black Widow's 6 arms, each holding a throwing knife, swiftly hurled them, precisely embedding them in the apples. The entire arena erupted in cheers and applause, shaking the restaurant. A dwarf approached, holding a wizard's hat, ready to collect money. He was also quite comical. His head was disproportionately large, with a distorted face beneath a bulging forehead, one eye larger than the other, and a pair of deformed legs with hard pads and thick brown curly fur on his feet, so he wore no shoes. The dwarf was a muggle beast, different from a squirrel, who was born into a wizarding family but couldn't use magic. A muggle beast, on the other hand, was a hybrid offspring of a muggle and a magical creature, hence its ugly appearance. Ralph tossed a nut into his wizard's hat, then a sequoia appeared in his hand, which he dropped into the dwarf's pocket. Finally, a gallon appeared in his hand. The boy played with the gallon. The coin, like a sprite, tumbled and spun rapidly between his fingers, as if performing a joyful dance. The dwarf stared greedily at the gallon, bowing and asking, Sir, what are your orders? I'd like to know what the mermaid you're going to perform tomorrow looks like. Ralph smiled. Is she beautiful? If she's too ugly, I won't watch. The dwarf grinned. Sir, I haven't seen that mermaid yet, but Mr. Scamander said, it's the 2-tailed mermaid, the most beautiful kind. You absolutely can't miss it. Ralph's expression remained unchanged. With a flick of his finger, the gallon flew into the dwarf's pocket. He whispered, that's certainly something to look forward to. After the muggle beast had gone some distance, Fleur leaned close to the boy's ear and whispered, what's wrong? Do you remember I told you I have a mermaid friend? Ralph said with a somber look in his eyes, she's a 2-tailed mermaid, could it be her? Fleur was slightly taken aback. It's hard to say. Miss Sarah is all alone, and in unfamiliar waters. Ralph narrowed his eyes and said, I'm going to check. Hopefully it's not her. Do you need my help? Fleur asked. Not for now. Ralph shook his head. I'm just going to check. If anything happens, I'll write a note and have Grote give it to you. The boy raised his hand, a botricle perched in his palm. It looked Fleur up and down, then made a face. Fleur hesitated for a moment, then lowered her voice and asked, Ralph, what if it's confirmed, your friend? The boy smiled slightly. Then I can only use what I'm best at, reasoning with him. As the performance ended, the audience slowly dispersed. The house elves hurriedly packed their belongings, locking the orcs in cages and moving them into a tent. Scamander, holding his wizard's hat, counted the proceeds from tonight's performance. This wizard's hat was magical. Any gallon that fell in couldn't be retrieved, so he wasn't worried about the muggle beast stealing money from it. After tapping the item, Scamander whistled, summoning the muggle beast. He gave a contemptuous smile and said, Pete, get the galleons out of your pocket, Mr. Scamander, I didn't take any money. Pete's face showed terror. Scamander waved his wand, and a galleon and a sickle flew out of the muggle beast's pocket. Now what do you say? Scamander asked coldly. Why is there a galleon in my pocket? The dwarf stared wide-eyed, his face filled with disbelief. Who put it in my pocket? Scamander kicked Pete in the stomach, cursing, you ungrateful little bastard. Fuck your mother. But then his expression turned strange, and he spat a few times. He remembered that the muggle beast's mother was an invisible beast. He was the one who suffered. Scamander swung his wand like a whip, lashing out fiercely. The dwarf fell to the ground, a deep, thin welt of blood appearing on his face. Scamander lashed the dwarf 10 times in quick succession. The dwarf lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his face flushed, sobbing pitifully. Why did that man give you galleons? He asked if the mermaid for tomorrow was pretty. The dwarf cried. I told him she was very pretty, and that he shouldn't miss out. Scamander's eyes turned cold. Could it be an Auror? No, sir, I swear, he's just a teenager, the dwarf assured him. If I see him again, I'll recognize him. If it weren't for your skill in taming magical creatures, I would have thrown you to that Black Widow tonight, Scamander said with disgust. If you dare take money again, I'll cut off your hand. Scamander pointed his wand at the tent, which folded and folded, growing smaller and smaller until it was the size of a handkerchief, which he put in his pocket. Let's go, to receive the goods. I heard it's a two-tailed mermaid. Chapter 266. Her name is Misala. Knock, knock, knock. A rhythmic knocking sound suddenly echoed in the deserted corridor. An oak door, nailed with a heavy chain, had a magnificent oil lamp hanging from its end, its purple flame enveloping a leaded red glass lampshade. As the knocking continued, a dark shadow appeared on the glass, opening its mouth and uttering an aged voice. Who is visiting so late at night? The mysterious circus. Scamander visits Mrs. Helen. The hood of the invisibility cloak was pulled back, revealing the face of a middle-aged man. Scamander's head floated in midair, looking quite eerie. The chain fell, and the heavy wooden door creaked open. Scamander stepped inside, and the door closed again. It was a large guest room, unlit, but the fireplaces at either end burned brightly, filling the room with a somber red glow. An ugly, flat-nosed, plump witch stood by the fireplace. She wore a brown cloak, and her heavy braid, reaching past her waist, was adorned with many small gold bells. Mrs. Helen, it's been a long time. Scamander sat down in a chair and chuckled. Still so cautious, in our line of work, caution never hurts. The plump witch moved, the bells on her body jingling with each step. Human trafficking, in many countries, it's a capital offense. And Helen not only trafficked wizards but also smuggled various precious magical creatures. So, I couldn't wait to pick up the goods tonight. Scamander rubbed his hands together, eagerly saying, I read in your letter that the quality of this shipment is very high. Yes, I dare say, this is the most beautiful humanoid creature I've captured in all these years. Helen blinked her dark eyes, praising, Minefield can't compare to her beauty. Trust me, you'll be satisfied. Hurry up and show it to me, Scamander urged. He had dealt with Helen for many years, buying many magical creatures from her. The woman's only flaw was greed, but her taste was impeccable. The fat witch walked to the bedside, bent down, and pulled a large black trunk from under the bed. Lady Helen then pulled open her bodice, took out a warm bronze key from between her plump breasts, inserted it into the lock, gently turned it, and lifted the lid. Scamander immediately leaned over and looked down. The trunk had been enlarged with a seamless stretch charm, reaching a depth of 4 meters. The box was filled with water, and in the water was a two-tailed mermaid with curly, fluffy golden hair and flawless, snow-white skin. The young mermaid heard the sound of the lid being opened, looked up, and saw a male wizard beside the witch who had captured her. Terrified, the girl dove into the water. So beautiful, Scamander gazed at the stunning face with admiration. He asked curiously, how did you capture her? That's a trade secret. Helen slammed the box shut and whispered, don't frighten my little darling. Helen paced around the room again, then smiled and asked, any other questions? Scamander thought for a moment and asked, any hidden injuries? Injuries? Helen seemed insulted. She shrieked, such a perfect work of art, do you think I would damage her? After I captured her, I fed her the best food and haven't even touched her once, and the price, 10,000 galleons, do you think that's possible? Scamander said disdainfully, why don't you just rob Gringotts? Why not? Helen chuckled and sat down on the sofa. With her looks, those pure-blood families would be willing to pay a high price for her. You're one of my regular customers, so I'm considering you first. But if you can't afford it, I'll contact other customers. Mrs. Helen, as far as I know, Scamander said calmly, the Mayflower has started checking first-class luggage. Do you think you can easily take it out of the ship if you keep it in your possession? Helen's expression shifted between light and shadow. Not only were they checking luggage, but they'd even activated an anti-apparition charm. She brought it on board, but couldn't take it off, which was indeed why she was eager to get rid of it. Scamander crossed his legs and said decisively, 7,000 galleons, I'll buy it. Pretty sincere, right? With that mermaid's beauty, she could cause a sensation anywhere in the world. She could earn back the ticket price in a year or two, and he wouldn't lose money even if he resold it. Deal. Helen nodded and took out a key. Scamander also took out galleons, and suddenly asked, by the way, I heard that a cabless dragon attacked the Mayflower. That's right, it's probably related to this mermaid. Helen thought for a moment and guessed, I caught her and boarded the ship from England, and that very night the cabless dragon attacked. That night, she almost wanted to release the mermaid, but fortunately, a boy stepped forward and saved the entire ship. Helen took the wallet made of shape-shifting lizard skin, counting the galleons as she asked with a strange expression, do you know who repelled the cabless dragon? Who? A boy. Helen grinned and said, I've seen him, he's very handsome, I dreamed about him that night. I immediately had the idea of collecting him. Helen even had a bold idea, which was to put that boy and the mermaid together for breeding. The offspring would definitely be even more amazing. Then why didn't you do anything? Scamander asked with a smile. Are you scared? I am quite scared, but I can repel Cabro Dragon. Helen's lips curled up. You must be very interested in his last name. What? Scamander. Scamander's breathing suddenly quickened, and he smiled sharply. Newt Scamander is on this ship too. No, he isn't. Helen shook her head. Only his grandson is on the ship. Don't be afraid. Scared. Scamander immediately relaxed, but said, You think I'm afraid of Newt Scamander? Since his grandson is here, I'm going to ask that kid for some interest first. Helen successfully fueled the fire and smiled. Then good luck. Back in his room, Scamander placed a box on the floor. Inside the room, the bed was propped up in the corner, but a large black tent had been erected. Mr. Scamander, the cargo has been retrieved. Muggle Pete immediately went to greet him. Yes, it cost me 7,000 galleons. That slut Helen, Scamander cursed, I'll fuck her to death sooner or later, so expensive. Pete was taken aback. She's certainly a rare beauty. Scamander smiled with satisfaction. Take the box and key into the tent. I'm going to take a shower first, and then I'll come out and train this mermaid, so she can perform on stage tomorrow night. Yes, Scamander went to the bathroom to shower, while Pete picked up the box and key and walked deeper into the tent. Pete walked slower and slower, then suddenly stopped, eager to see just how beautiful the mermaid he had bought for 7,000 galleons really was. Pete was itching to see more. Knowing that Scamander would be showering for a while, he boldly picked up the key, inserted it into the box, opened it, and peered inside. Pete stared at the mermaid, stunned. He gazed at the girl with fascination, and in a trembling voice, called out into the box, What's your name? Her name is Missera. A cold voice suddenly sounded behind Pete. The dwarf tried to turn around, but a hand gripped his neck and slowly lifted him up. Pete struggled to breathe, trying to scream for help, but the hand felt like an iron clamp, tightly constricting his throat, leaving him only able to utter barely audible screams. Rolf watched Pete, a smile playing on his lips, but his eyes grew increasingly cold. He slammed the dwarf's neck against a glass jar. Chapter 267 You Can Call Me Tom Riddle. Rolf grabbed Pete and slammed him against the glass jar. His head shattered instantly, half his body disappearing inside. Water flooded his lungs, and the dwarf's body writhed like an eel. Inside the jar, a gray head the size of a quake ball was submerged. It had no body, only thick, varicose arms on either side of its head. This was clearly another deformed creature. The deformed creature opened its lifeless, gray eyes, its arms suddenly clamping down on Pete's head, its mouth snapping open to bite his nose, tearing at it violently, blood oozing out. Pete was instantly in excruciating pain. Just as he was about to suffocate, the hand pulled him out and threw him to the ground. Pete's nose, bitten off, felt like it was being burned. He touched it, trembling with pain, cold sweat pouring down his face. The dwarf struggled to turn over, trying to open his eyes. Through his blurred vision, he looked up and saw a young face he remembered vividly. Pete's eyes widened in shock. This was the blonde boy who had given him money tonight, and asked if the mermaid was beautiful, causing him to get beaten up by Scamander. Rolf looked down at the dwarf slumped on the ground, a smirk playing on his lips. You were right, this mermaid is indeed very beautiful, so I'm taking her, Mr. Scamander, someone's stealing. Before Pete could finish his sentence, Rolf kicked him in the head, his skull slamming into the ground, knocking him unconscious. The boy walked to the box, peered inside, and sighed at the mermaid at the bottom. How did it get like this? Miss Alla, her long hair flowing freely in the water like a blooming golden lotus, heard a familiar voice. She looked up in disbelief, and when she saw the boy, she froze. At that moment, tears streamed down her face. All right, it's all over. Rove was silent for a moment, then tapped the box and chuckled. Stay here for a bit, I'll take you out. The boy closed the lid and put it back into his black leather suitcase. He picked up the suitcase and walked towards the tent's exit. The mysterious circus tent, like his suitcase, had been expanded with an unseen stretch arm, creating countless spaces. The space he was in was filled with various deformed creatures. Besides the small, fist-sized monster from before, there were also the Catwoman and Spider-Man who had performed not long ago. These were not normal magical creatures, they were deformed. They were either the product of magical experiments or the result of interbreeding and hybridization between different species of magical animals: a giant python with one head and two bodies, a centaur with 3 arms, 1 leg, and 2 heads, a tortoise child with a turtle shell covering its back, a vampire with tree bark on its skin. Of course, besides these living creatures, there were also many conjoined creatures, preserved as specimens in formalin. In a corner, Rove also saw 2 skeletons, one embracing the other in a peculiar posture. The skeleton being embraced was perfectly normal, a human skeleton, but the other one, its spine was crooked, its head tucked into its shoulder blades, and one leg was noticeably shorter than the other. Below the skeleton was an inscription in gold: Quasimodo and Esmeralda of Notre Dame. Besides these, there were the remains of 2 of Galileo's fingers, the mummy of Ramses the Great, the patina-covered heads of Cromwell and Wang Mang, a slice of Einstein's brain. Scamander was clearly more than just a fanatic about deformed creatures. He also enjoyed collecting the remains of various wizards and famous muggles. His interests were quite diverse. Ralph passed through the deformed creature section and soon entered the magical creature section, where there were even more magical creatures: a hairy, cow-sized rat boar, a stinging scorpion-tailed lion, a giant piranha, a terrifying longhorn lizard with sickle-like claws, many dangerous magical creatures. Even the boy was seeing them for the first time. But compared to Ralph and Newt's boxes, which were specially designed to provide suitable living environments for magical creatures, the magical creatures of the mysterious circus were all locked in magical cages. They were all tools used for performance. Ralph had promised Captain Carlos not to clash with Scamander, and he had intended to leave, but now, after finding Ursula and seeing so many treasures, the boy suddenly didn't want to leave for some reason. After all, he was a person who reasoned with others, and he at least wanted to explain his reasons to Scamander. After a moment of silence, Ralph strode towards a huge cage. Inside the cage was a magical creature with black stripes behind its ears, and silver-gray back and outer limbs, looking very much like a cougar. This was a leopard cat, a magical creature from North America, capable of walking upright, and possessing the ability to hypnotize and legatee. This leopard cat, which should have been running in the Appalachian Mountains, was now covered in wounds, looked malnourished, and had many whip marks. Ralph abruptly drew his wand, pointing the tip at the magical lock. With an explosion, the cage opened. The cat-leopard cautiously emerged, giving Ralph a deep look before quickly running away. A commotion erupted in the tent, and the magical creatures in the other cages, like a swarm of bees buzzing excitedly, hissed. But then, a scream rang out from inside the tent. Clearly, the lock was enchanted, and forcibly opening it would trigger an alarm. At that moment, the tent flap automatically sealed shut. Ralph ignored it, moving to the second cage and releasing another horned beast. As the boy approached the third cage, he felt something tugging at his ankle. Looking down, Ralph saw dark fingers gripping his calf, crawling up his thigh. A fairy dagger appeared in his hand. He severed the arm, the severed arm writhing on the ground, its fingers opening and closing repeatedly. Soon, a group of wizards, their bodies entirely black, emerged from the ground. Cloaked and hooded, they slid towards him, their eyes hollow beneath the hoods. They were Inni. Ralph waved his wand, a red light striking one of the Inni, the spell splitting its face in two, creating a deep, bone-revealing gash through its cheek. But not a drop of blood flowed. They seemed oblivious, continuing their staggering approach to the boy. Where did this thief come from? A booming voice rang out from the tent. Dare to cause trouble in my mysterious circus. You want to die? Scamander, disturbed in the middle of a bath, appeared in the distance, cloaked, his face contorted with terrifying rage as he stared intently at the blond boy surrounded by the Inni. Boy, who are you? Ralph turned to the middle-aged wizard, giving an elegant bow and a slight smile. Mr. Scamander, you may call me Tom Riddle. Chapter 268. Gentlemen, please listen to the dragon's roar. Upon hearing the boy identify himself as Tom Riddle, Scamander couldn't help but frown. He certainly didn't believe the boy's nonsense. The reason was simple: Scamander had dealt with that man many times in the past, had a long-term working relationship with him, and knew him quite well, so he knew who Tom Riddle was referring to. Speaking of Tom Riddle, Scamander suddenly remembered something. The Dark Lord still owed him money. Years ago, Voldemort bought a batch of expensive magical creatures from him, but before he could pay, he died. Death doesn't erase debts, and Scamander had even gone to Malfoy to collect the money. Unexpectedly, this servant of the Dark Lord flatly denied being a Death Eater, saying he wasn't familiar with the Dark Lord and told him not to slander him. This lightning-fast change of attitude could only be described as a deep bond between master and servant. So many years had passed, and Scamander had almost forgotten about it, but this boy's self-identification as Tom Riddle brought back this bad debt. How interesting. Scamander also remembered that Voldemort had said many times that he wouldn't die and would return no matter what. Whether Scamander believed it or not, since you call yourself Tom Riddle, can we settle the bill first? If you're willing to settle it, I'll accept your name, Merlin, too. Upon hearing Scamander say that Voldemort owed him money, Ralph initially despised the Dark Lord's deadbeat ways, then quickly retorted, "What does Voldemort owing you money have to do with me, Tom Riddle?" Scamander's gaze remained fixed on the boy, then shifted downwards to the box in the boy's hand. He suddenly remembered Helen's words and narrowed his eyes, saying, "You're Newt Scamander's grandson, aren't you?" Caught off guard, Ralph showed no embarrassment or feigned ignorance, simply replying, "Oh, so you know my grandfather, more than just know him." Scamander took a deep breath and said, "We left a deep mark on each other back then." Many people assumed Scamander's left ear was gone, that it was caused by a magical creature, but only he knew it was that man who had severed it. Scamander desperately wanted revenge, and even, at Helen's suggestion, considered causing trouble for his grandson. Unexpectedly, this kid had delivered himself to his doorstep, a truly unexpected delight. Skull suppressed his inner elation and asked, "So, kid, why did you break into my room tonight? And into my tent? You wanted to see the circus, but it doesn't start until tomorrow night." "I gave that dwarf a galleon and a sickle," Ralph shrugged. "He promised to sell me 2 magical creatures, and I was just picking them out. That little money, you think you can buy a cat leopard and a horned beast?" Skull looked at the open cage and sneered. "Do you think that's possible?" "Why not?" Ralph asked suspiciously. "You wouldn't do business dishonestly, would you?" "I'm just a kid, don't lie to me. I was bitten by a dog when I was little." The boy's eyes were as cold as knives as he chuckled softly. "When I go crazy, even I'm afraid of myself. You can have it." Skull stared at the box in Ralph's hand, his eyes filled with greed. "But you can leave your box behind." He knew Newt Scamander's box was special. It was very large, exceptionally large, filled with countless magical creatures, which were what he coveted most. It seemed the box in Newt's grandson's hand also had the same effect. "Want it?" Ralph held up the box with one hand. "Beckoning it. Come and get it yourself. No rush, I have plenty of infernals in this tent." "Let them." Scamander's eyes turned cold, and he grinned maliciously. "Let's play a little." He waved his wand, and the infernals, who had just been ordered to pause their attack, pounced on the boy again. Almost simultaneously, Ralph's mind stirred, and he silently chanted, "Ice arrows." A row of ice arrows instantly condensed in the air. The boy raised his hand and released them, and slender, chilling rays of light flew out in a fan shape. The Cabro Dragon's magical talent was to lower temperature, and Ralph had acquired this spell after capturing the Cabro Dragon. The Mayflower was sailing on the ocean, where the air was filled with moisture. Combined with the water monster's ability to control the water, Ralph could easily condense water into ice. Countless ice arrows rained down. The infernals were slow and had no time to dodge, nor did they try, and were directly hit. The infernals were too densely packed. Many ice arrows even pierced through the chests of 2 infernals, stringing them together like candied hawthorns. Black liquid slowly oozed from their wounds, like black snakes, corroding the ice arrows. Their attack was only halted for a moment before they continued their tireless charge. Ralph didn't care. He raised his hand, drawing a semicircle, and another volley of ice arrows spread out rapidly like a fan. He calmly said, "Fire." The rain of arrows swept over them again. After 5 consecutive volleys, the infernals in the front row were reduced to severed limbs and mutilated remains. But even so, even with only an arm and a head remaining, they still writhed violently on the floor, crawling towards the boy. This was the terrifying aspect of the infernals. They were already dead, enemies that would never fall. Scamander, watching from a distance, was also utterly shocked. This kid clearly wasn't using a wand, yet he could summon ice arrows. Was he casting spells without a wand? But how old was he? Moreover, those effortless volleys of ice arrows were not the kind of attacks a boy his age could muster. Was this kid protected by some magical creature? Or perhaps an alchemical artifact? Scamander was uncertain, but he knew the boy's methods against the infernals were futile. He was clearly too young and lacked combat experience. Taking advantage of Ralph's focus on the infernals, Scamander, hiding in the corner, suddenly raised his wand, a red beam of light sneeringly aimed at Rolf's back. Faint, Rolf, though not turning around, seemed to have eyes in the back of his head, immediately leaning back and flattening his back against the ground, barely dodging the cunning sneak attack. From a cage in the distance came the frantic barking of a swallow-tailed hound. Hearing the hound's warning, Scander's expression changed drastically, and he dodged to the side. An ice arrow grazed past, not piercing Scander's head, but still grazing his face, instantly drawing blood. "What a pity," Ralph said, standing up. "I didn't kill you." Scander didn't bother wiping the blood from his face, frowning. "You deliberately created an opening to lure me in, then attacked me while my attention was on you." "Not too stupid," Ralph said, a smirk playing on his lips. "If that swallow-tailed hound hadn't warned you, you would be dead." "But how did you dodge my stun spell?" Scander asked curiously. The spider sense of the eight-eyed giant spider was enough for Ralph to sense danger in advance, and the golden flying man's flexible joint locks allowed him to perform unimaginably difficult evasive maneuvers. However, Ralph didn't explain, only mocking. "Any first-year student at Hogwarts could dodge your weak attacks." Scander's voice was sharp and grating. "Boy, you've angered me." "So what?" Ralph said with a fake smile. "Come on, don't just hide in the corner. These infernals can't kill me." "It's all right. The infernals are just appetizers." Scander laughed. "You don't think you'll leave here tonight, do you? You can only blame yourself for being too arrogant and barging into my tent. I'm thinking of a better opponent for you, a horned beast, a venomous leopard, a scorpion-tail beast, a giant python, or an eight-eyed spider." Scander pretended to think for a moment, his face sinister, and he grinned. "How about all of them, 5 against 1? Don't say I'm bullying you, after all, you're Mr. Newt Scamander's grandson. Dealing with these magical creatures is a piece of cake for you, isn't it?" Ice arrows continued to be fired, slowing down the infernal's attack. Ralph, hands in his pockets, chuckled lightly and asked, "Then can I choose a dragon?" Scander gave a puzzled hum, unsure of the boy's meaning. "Mr. Scander, does your circus not have dragons, or are you afraid that releasing one would be too destructive and burn down this tent?" Ralph grinned, carrying the box in one hand. "Then let me ask you something else. Guess, if there's a dragon here." Scander's face darkened. He couldn't believe Newt would put a dangerous dragon in the box of a 12 or 13-year-old. That box was just a toy, at most containing some not-so-powerful magical creatures, not something as dangerous as a dragon. Absolutely impossible. This kid was bluffing. With an innocent-looking face, Ralph slowly opened the box, a bright smile on his face. "Let me show you my Norwegian Ridgeback dragon," he said. "Don't say I'm bullying you, after all, you're Mr. Scander of the mysterious circus." Ralph whistled, and a moment later, a colossal creature flew out of the box, its enormous wings, as black as night, casting a shadow on the ground. "Gentlemen, hear the dragon's roar, 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 roar." Sorry for the slight delay, but it's a long chapter of 2,800 words after all. Chapter 269. Carlos, I must be dreaming. Inside the large tent, all the commotion and shouts ceased. Every pair of magical creatures' eyes were fixed on the sky, on the roaring Norwegian Spinosaurus. After a year and a half of growth, Norwegian Spinosaurus had a wingspan of 7 meters. Its scales, the color of black jade, gleamed with a cold light, and a massive, thick ridge ran along its back. Its tail was as straight as an iron rod, ending in a huge tail hammer with triangular spikes. Ralph rode on the Spinosaurus's neck, looking down with a leisurely air. Without the suppression of the ice arrows, the shadows charged forward. But the fire dragon twisted its body, its tail sweeping in a circle, sweeping across the shadows like a broom, clearing a large clearing. The spiked tail hammer struck the shadows like a heavy hammer, instantly disemboweling them, causing them to convulse on the ground, black blood gushing out. Norbert was like a giant road roller, its relentless sweeping and trampling leaving behind a trail of limbs and carcasses, some crushed into pulp. "Fire," Ralph commanded. Norbert raised its long, black-scaled neck, opened its mouth, smoke billowing from its teeth, and a dark orange glow emanated from its throat. Dragon breath erupted, a furnace-like flame sweeping towards the onrushing infernos. The undead infernos were instantly engulfed by the flames the moment they touched the breath, the rapid burning speed, it was as if their skin were gasoline and their bones dry tinder. Under Norbert's flames, the wave after wave of infernos were quickly incinerated, but Scander didn't reappear, Instead, he suddenly vanished, disappearing without a trace. Rolf didn't search for Scamander. To make him grieve, he had to deal with the magical creatures. The boy rode Norbert towards the magical cage. However, he didn't open the cages again to release the magical creatures inside. After all, this was the vast ocean, and even if they were released, most of them wouldn't be able to escape. Moreover, letting them roam freely on the Mayflower might harm other wizards. It would be better to transfer them to his own chest first, simple and safe. So, Ralph set a small goal: to empty the mysterious circus and bankrupt Scamander. He remembered that Scamander had said he would send horned beasts, venomous panthers, and scorpion-tailed beasts to attack him, so he would transfer them first. As the boy waved his wand, cages floated in the air, spinning as they flew into the chest. Ralph was just like a Niffler entering a vault, taking whatever he saw without any discrimination. But not long after, a chilling roar echoed from afar. He turned his head and saw two enormous half-bird, half-dragon magical creatures flying rapidly towards him. They were adult bird-like man-eating monsters with huge beaks and sharp teeth. They looked very much like fire dragons, but they couldn't breathe fire. The two bird-like man-eating monsters were both adults, each with a wingspan of nearly 10 meters, while Norbert hadn't yet reached his maximum size and was no match for them. This was clearly Scamander's killing move to deal with Rolf and Norbert. Upon seeing the bird-like man-eating monsters, Rolf didn't linger. He lightly tapped Norbert's neck and shouted, "Take off!" Black wings unfurled with a thunderous roar. The earth was suddenly left beneath their feet, and the fire dragon struggled to climb, carrying him upwards. Chase after them, Scamander. Riding on the back of one of the bird-like man-eating monsters, roared angrily, "Kill them!" The two bird-like man-eating monsters were very fast. Rolf glanced back. At this distance, being caught was only a matter of time. He thought for a moment, then immediately ordered Norbert to continue spewing flames. However, the target wasn't the bird-like man-eating monsters, but the tent. As flames erupted, the magical tent quickly burst into flames, orange tongues of fire licking the curtains. Once a fire started, it would quickly spread to other places, one after another, and soon the surrounding area became a sea of fire. Scamander roared in frustration. Fighting in his own tent offered a home field advantage, but it also made it vulnerable to destruction. Scamander had no choice but to send one of the bird-like man-eating monsters in pursuit, while he rode another to extinguish the fire. This tent contained decades of his accumulated wealth. If it were burned to ashes, he would wish for death. After dodging several dragon breaths, the lone bird-like man-eating monster was closing in. Norbert's speed was far inferior to the bird-like man-eating monster. The difference in strength was like a third-generation fighter jet facing a fifth-generation fighter jet. The bird-like man-eating monster quickly closed the distance, opening its massive jaws to bite Norbert, its huge fangs piercing two deep blood stains. The bird-like man-eating monster's most formidable features were its beak and fangs, capable of tearing through any prey, even a fire dragon. Norbert, on the other hand, was too young. Its scales hadn't matured over many years and were not yet thick enough. Norbert arched his back, roaring in agony, his tail lashing fiercely at the bird-like ogre's back. The ogre, however, seemed oblivious to the pain, continuing to tear at the dragon's flesh. At this rate, Norbert would be slowly worn down and killed. Ralph patted Norbert's head, and it immediately understood, closing its eyes. Suddenly, the boy's eyes lit up, and he shouted, "Dazzling flash!" A brilliant white light erupted in the sky, blinding the bird-like ogre. It cried out in panic. With a long roar, Norbert seized the opportunity, spitting a mouthful of phlegm, hot to 3,000 degrees Celsius, into the ogre's mouth. The ogre, catching the dragon's breath, plummeted downwards. Norbert flapped its wings again, unleashing crimson flames, bursting through the tent and room, and flying towards the sea. The dimly lit room was silent, save for a few embers burning in the fireplace, occasionally flickering with a dark red light. Carlos lay in bed, fast asleep just a moment ago, when suddenly he woke up with a start. He touched his thinning flaxen hair. His forehead was covered in cold sweat, as if he had just been pulled from the sea. Carlos had just had a nightmare. He dreamt that the Mayflower was attacked by a fire-breathing dragon, half of the ship was burned, and he committed suicide by sacrificing himself for the ship. Although he didn't become the longest-serving captain, he became the last captain. Carlos wiped his forehead. Although it was just a dream, he was still shaken, especially by the lingering sense of reality. He could still hear the dragon's roar. The dream was too real. I must have drunk too much rum last night. The alcohol amplified the hallucinations, Carlos reassured himself. He called out, "Rob, get me something to sober up." "Yes, Mr. Carlos." A house elf responded and walked to the bedside, bringing a cup to him. Carlos took a sip of the hangover cure with lemon juice. It was too sour, but he still held it in his mouth to perk himself up. But the dragon's roar didn't disappear. Instead, it grew clearer and stronger. Carlos suddenly burst into laughter. "Rob, let me tell you a joke. I just dreamt that a fire dragon appeared on the Mayflower and burned the ship, and I can still hear its roar. Isn't that hilarious? How could a fire dragon possibly appear on our ship? It's killing me." Ho ha ho ha. Carlos got out of bed, threw away the hangover cure, poured himself a full glass of rum, and gulped it down. "Sir, that wasn't a dream." Rob pointed tremblingly out the window. "The fire dragon, it's right there. Look." Carlos stumbled to the window, opened it, and the cold air sent shivers down his spine. He leaned closer to the windowsill and looked out at the sea. There, he saw a huge fire dragon circling on the surface, roaring. A cabin on the ship was engulfed in flames, billowing black smoke, like a scene from a dream. Ho ha ho ha, I'm definitely still dreaming, Carlos convinced himself. I'm definitely still struggling in this nightmare. When I wake up, the Mayflower will still be safe and sound, and no fire dragon will appear, I promise. Carlos slapped himself hard. Ouch, that hurts. Chapter 270 Hibiscus. Ralph was learning a foreign language with me in the middle of the night. In the vast ocean, the probability of a ship catching fire and being destroyed is probably lower than the probability of hitting an iceberg and sinking. Therefore, although the Mayflower was on fire, strikingly similar to the situation in his dream, Carlos remained calm. As a veteran captain with 30 years of experience, he simply ordered the magical ship to sink to the bottom of the sea. The entire fire extinguishing process took less than 5 minutes, simple and brutal. After putting out the fire, Carlos immediately rushed to the scene of the incident. When he arrived, it was already surrounded by layers upon layers of wizards watching the spectacle. Carlos squeezed through the crowd and found Scamander beside a tent riddled with holes and blackened by smoke. This mysterious circus owner was covered in dust, his hair singed yellow, looking quite miserable. Mr. Scamander, what happened? Carlos asked. Did someone see a fire dragon rush out of your room? Can you explain? This has nothing to do with me. Scamander dusted himself off, suppressing his anger, and stood up. Someone broke into my room, stole my magical creatures for performances, and released a fire dragon that burned down my tent. Hearing Scamander's words, everyone whispered among themselves. Do you know who did it? Nit Scamander's grandson, Scamander said angrily, pursing his lips. A blonde boy. Hearing this name, the commotion grew even louder, and Carlos looked stunned, his eyes filled with horror. You mean Mr. Ralph Scamander? Carlos frowned. Are you sure it's him? You're not mistaken? I mean, this is a very serious accusation. Do you have any evidence? Of course. Checking his suitcase will make it clear. Scamander gritted his teeth. He took away quite a few of my magical creatures. It's obvious. Scamander's words sounded absurd, like a fabricated story, but for some reason, Carlos felt he wasn't lying. Others might not know, but he knew for sure that the horse-shaped water monster wasn't kept by the Mayflower. It had indeed been released from the boy's suitcase. If Ralph could carry a water monster with him, then having a fire dragon didn't seem so far-fetched. That kid had promised him earlier that he wouldn't cause any conflict with a mysterious circus, so how did he manage to create such a big scandal in the middle of the night? Carlos was a little flustered and reluctant to check the suitcase. After all, if he really found something, he couldn't very well protect that kid in front of everyone. Scamander seemed to sense Carlos's hesitation and shouted, Everyone, come with me to Scamander's room. He keeps a fire dragon. Encouraged by Scamander, everyone headed towards Ralph's room. Carlos had no choice but to follow. All he could do was buy the boy some time. If it really was him, hopefully he had already cleaned up the mess. The group quickly arrived at a room. Carlos, steeling himself, knocked several times, but no one answered. Scamander grinned triumphantly, saying, That kid's probably still riding his fire dragon, not back in his room yet. But before he could finish, the door suddenly burst open, and a boy peeked out, seemingly startled by the sight of so many wizards at the door. What's wrong, Mr. Carlos? Carlos took a breath and smiled. Mr. Scamander, This gentleman just accused you of breaking into his room and releasing a fire dragon. Ah, is he talking about me? Ralph looked astonished and protested. How could I do such a thing? I've been in my room all night and haven't gone out at all. Why is this gentleman framing me? Framing you? Scamander's eyes seemed to spit fire as he roared. Your box. Let me check it. That involves my privacy. You have no right to check it. But, Ralph sighed slightly. To protect my reputation, I'm willing to have it checked. The boy returned to the room and quickly brought out more a black box, which he handed to Carlos. In front of everyone, Carlos opened the box directly, but inside were only some personal belongings, nothing else. This isn't your suitcase, Scamander said angrily. You switched it. There's only one suitcase in my room. You can search it if you don't believe me. Rove shrugged. Then this suitcase is enchanted, blocking the entrance. Let me check. Scamander reached out to grab it. But Rove was faster. He had already taken the suitcase back from Carlos. He shook his head and said, Mr. Carlos is a notary. He found nothing wrong with his inspection, but you're different. You're the accuser. What if he tampered with my suitcase? That's right, Carlos nodded. I didn't find any magic. Mr. Scamander, do you not trust me? Scamander's face darkened, his expression furious. I have a witness. Pete, a dwarf, pushed his way out of the crowd, his head covered in blood and thick bandages. Rove looked up at the dwarf with a half-smile. His cold gaze fell on Pete's face, making him tremble and goosebumps rise on his arms. Scamander kicked Pete with his toe, urging, Speak up, you little bastard. Who hurt you? It was him. Pete raised his hand tremblingly, pointing at Ralph. I was watching the mermaid when he suddenly appeared, snatched the mermaid, and injured me. Is this what you call witness testimony? Ralph scoffed. Since when can the words of the Muggle beast be considered evidence? I don't remember the Department of Magic classifying this species as human. That's right, Carlos said thoughtfully. This is a Muggle beast, not a witness. Then do you have a witness to prove you're in the room tonight? Scamander roared. If you have one, even just one, I'll apologize to you immediately. I'll vouch for Ralph. A clear voice suddenly came from the crowd, and everyone turned to look. A silver-haired girl walked out, so beautiful that she attracted everyone's attention the moment she appeared. Fleur walked slowly to the boy's side, blinked, and said, I stayed in Rove's room all night until I saw the dragon, so it couldn't have been him. A commotion erupted, the commotion becoming deafening. Carlos tilted his head, looking at Fleur with a strange expression, then at Rove, and asked a question on everyone's mind. What were you doing in Mr. Scamander's room in the middle of the night? I was teaching him French. Fleur's cheeks flushed, and she blinked her increasingly bright eyes, whispering, Rove is working very hard to learn French from me, until late at night, that's all. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 271. These days, who still takes traditional foreign language classes? Scamander claimed that. Scamander, accompanied by a fire-breathing dragon, broke into his room and set his tent on fire, while the stunningly beautiful girl before him said that Scamander had spent the entire night in her room studying foreign languages with her. With each side sticking to their own story, everyone fell silent, not to consider whose statement was more believable, but to deliberate which behavior was more outrageous. It seemed that either of these things Scamander did left everyone speechless. Ralph hadn't expected Fleur to come forward and give false testimony for him. His initial plan was to argue with Scamander, since the latter had no evidence. But since Fleur had stepped forward, Ralph immediately said, Mr. Scamander, I found a witness now. What else do you have to say? You two were in cahoots all along. Scamander roared angrily. Give me your box. There's definitely something inside. Scamander reached for the box, but the next moment, he suddenly turned his head, and a small water blade flashed past, striking the wall and turning into a puddle of water. A bead of blood appeared on Scamander's left cheek, gradually expanding into a small, finger-length welt. Ralph raised his voice so everyone could hear him. Mr. Scamander, I respect you as much as I respect my defense against the dark arts professor. I'm also your circus's most loyal fan. Tonight I tipped you a galleon, a sicko, and in that, my month's allowance. The boy walked forward slowly, his voice steady and loud. So, you said there was something wrong with my box, so I took it out and had Mr. Carlos check it, but he found nothing wrong. You then asked me to find witnesses, which I did. I've already given you plenty of face, but please don't, Ralph said, enunciating each word clearly. You're asking for it. The boy walked to Pete's side and gently patted the dwarf's shoulder. Pete shrank back, trembling all over, his face filled with fear and unease. Mr. Scamander, you don't think I'm just an unarmed little wizard with no elders by my side, and you can frame me however you want, do you? Isn't this bullying an honest man? Ralph shouted angrily. I'll clarify again, the burning of your circus has nothing to do with me. You have no evidence, so please stop bothering me. Otherwise, the next time your tent is burned, it might very well be related to me. You know, even a niffler will bite if pushed too far. Everyone looked at the indignant blond boy, his handsome face filled with innocence and grievance. It was enough to make men speechless and women feel pity. Everyone immediately believed him. Yes, how could such a simple, kind, and honest boy be such a vicious arsonist? The group of wizards then looked at Scamander, his wrinkled old face, his yellowish hair, his tangled beard covering his fat double chin, his clenched fists, and a flash of savagery on his face. He didn't look like a good person at all. Who's lying? It's obvious from their appearance. Scamander's face turned incredibly ugly. He sneered, Are you threatening me? Threatening you? Ralph put on an innocent look. No, you're slandering me, slandering the youngest recipient of the Order of Merlin, a two-time recipient of the Hogwarts Special Merit Award. You know, I didn't rely on lies and slander to capture Peter Pettigrew and help Sirius clear his name, but on my own righteousness. Ralph's righteous indignation almost made Scamander doubt himself. Could it be that the person wasn't Scamander at all, but someone else impersonating him, deliberately framing him? Mr. Scamander, have I offended you before? Ralph asked suspiciously. I've never even met you. Why are you framing me like this? I understand now. The boy seemed to suddenly realize something. Not long ago, I killed a cablo dragon that attacked the Mayflower. That guy, could it be an animal that escaped from your circus? Otherwise, I really don't understand why you're targeting me like this. Scamander, hearing Ralph's words, everyone's gaze towards Scamander changed instantly, from simply looking on with amusement to deep suspicion. Yes, this guy runs a circus, carrying all sorts of magical creatures, so isn't it normal for him to have a cablo dragon? No wonder we see Canadian cablo dragons in the Atlantic Ocean. We've found a reason. It was you, the old bastard, who released it to cause trouble. It must be him, a black-haired wizard said. Catch him and send him to the Magical Congress of America for trial. As soon as he finished speaking, everyone else echoed him. You're talking nonsense, Scamander roared. I didn't. It wasn't me. Even if the cabro dragon has nothing to do with you, how do you explain the fire dragon? Ralph's face was filled with contempt, and he smirked. Mr. Scamander, you have no evidence to prove that I'm involved, so it can only be related to you. That fire dragon is the magical creature that escaped from your circus. Scamander was so angry that he couldn't speak. This was true slander. Your silence says it all. Ralph looked at the crowd and said loudly, The arrival of the mysterious circus has not brought us joy, but only fire dragons and danger. Instantly, the crowd was enraged. Scamander could feel the anger of the people around him rising. Their emotions had been stirred up by Ralph to the point of almost bursting into flames. Ralph finally pressed his hand down and calmly asked, Mr. Scamander, do you have anything else to say? If not, let this farce end here. I'm tired of your ugly face. Scamander knew there was no way to pursue Scamander tonight. He turned to leave, but his path was blocked. The wizards were all convinced that Scamander had released the cabro dragon, and now they were like relentless, bloodthirsty hounds, demanding he take responsibility. Carlos stood in the crowd, watching helplessly as the boy incited the wizards step by step. He was horrified, but at this point, Scamander was utterly defeated. He had no choice but to step forward and say, Mr. Scamander, why don't you stay in your room for a while? Explain to the Aurors after you arrive in America. Fine, Scamander said, suppressing his anger. If everyone believes I'm responsible for some fabricated crime, then I'm happy to explain to the Aurors. Admitting defeat was the only option at the moment, especially since over a dozen wizards had drawn their wands and pointed them at him. Carlos took the wand from Scamander's hand, and the tense atmosphere around them noticeably eased. Well done, Scamander stared into Ralph's eyes. I admit defeat today, kid. You're much more eloquent than your grandfather. I've seen it all. We'll see. You flatter me. Ralph smiled. I actually have autism too. Professor Dumbledore taught me public speaking. If you'd like to learn, I think he'd be happy to speak with you personally." After saying this, Ralph grinned, revealing his gleaming white teeth. "All right, everyone, go home. It's the middle of the night. Don't crowd around here. I still need to continue studying French." Fleur, standing behind Ralph, rolled her eyes at the young man. Having witnessed such a spectacle tonight, everyone left reluctantly. Before leaving, Carlos patted Rove on the shoulder and said with a mischievous grin, "Rove, even though you're still young, you should seize the opportunity. Who still takes traditional foreign language classes these days, thanks to Little Demon in charge, and just love to wander in the water for their generous donations?" Chapter 272 I am a hunter without feelings. After everyone else left, only the Delacour family remained. Although it was late at night, the events of the night had been so dramatic and terrifying that no one was sleepy. Ralph welcomed them into the room and had his house elf bring them a hot midnight snack. The group sat around the fireplace and talked about the events of the night. Gabrielle clung to Fleur's arm, nuzzling against her like a kitten, and said, "Sister, you actually went to Rove's room to teach him French while I was asleep? You two secretly tutor each other every night, making progress, but you never take me with you. How cunning." Fleur felt something was off. Her face flushed slightly, and she tapped Gabrielle's head with her finger, saying, "Don't talk nonsense, nothing like that happened." "Hey, didn't you just say that in front of everyone?" Gabrielle said, somewhat aggrieved, "and now you're denying it. I was helping Rove out of a predicament. Didn't you see him being bullied by Scamander? So, you're lying?" Gabrielle's eyes widened, and she said angrily, "You clearly told me that children can't lie, that liars will be taken away by ghouls, and you lied yourself." That statement itself was a lie, and besides, she wasn't a child anymore. Fleur thought to herself. Of course, she couldn't say it aloud. She cleared her throat and said, "Gabrielle, this is called a white lie, understand? My intentions are good. You don't want to see Ralph arrested as an arsonist, do you? Is that so?" The little girl's eyes darted around, and she said thoughtfully, "Then can I tell white lies from now on?" "No." "Why?" Gabrielle puffed out her cheeks, dissatisfied. "My intentions are good too." "What intentions?" Fleur exposed the girl's thoughts. "Something like I lied because I didn't want Mom and Dad to get sick." Gabrielle was ruthlessly exposed. She snorted angrily, made a face, and turned to Mrs. Delacour to complain. "Mom, look, my sister, she's lying. Take away her allowance for this month, give it to me." Everyone couldn't help but laugh at Gabrielle's request. Mrs. Delacour hugged her little daughter and affectionately patted her head. "Gabrielle, sometimes lies are justified," Ralph assured the girl. "When your sister lied for me, that lie saved me, and it saved many innocent lives." Fleur's blush, still fresh, deepened. She felt a little embarrassed. Was she really as noble as Ralph claimed? She hadn't known. Ralph sat down and recounted his experiences at the circus that evening, including the captured mermaid Marcella. The mysterious circus is a den of iniquity, imprisoning countless deformed creatures and magical beings. After rescuing Marcella, I was about to release them, but Scamander discovered me. In the end, I had no choice but to burn his tent down. Ralph spoke casually, but the audience was deeply moved and their emotions remained complex for a long time. Who could have imagined that this very boy, riding a fire dragon, would burn down Scamander's mysterious circus? But considering his earlier battle against the Cabro dragon while riding a horse-like water monster, it didn't seem so unbelievable. "Did you raise that dragon?" Fleur asked curiously. "Actually, it belonged to a key-keeper at Hogwarts," Ralph explained. "After it hatched, he couldn't keep it at the school, so I reluctantly took care of it for him." Fleur's eye twitched. A key-keeper at Hogwarts was so secretive? No wonder Hogwarts' educational ranking was higher than Bugsbutton's. Their teaching philosophy was truly advanced. "Ralph, where do you keep your dragon?" Gabrielle asked. "In my chest," Ralph winked playfully. "My chest only looks small, it's actually a tiny bit bigger inside than outside." Everyone was speechless. Keeping a dragon probably wasn't just a matter of being a tiny bit bigger. Unseen stretching charm, Mrs. Delacour, who was drinking tea, smiled at her daughters. "I once went into Newt's chest, it was bigger than the forest where the villa lived. I was young then, but I still remember it vividly. It was a wonderful trip, bigger than the forest." Now, not only the Fleur sisters, but even Mr. Delacour was somewhat bewildered. That wasn't just a box, it was a whole summer. "Mother, did you see a dragon back then?" Gabrielle pressed. Not just dragons. Mrs. Delica rested her chin on her hand, gazing at the box beside the boy, a look of nostalgia on her still-present face. And the American thunderbird, the African venomous horned beast, the Asian zawu. I was only 7 years old then, and my biggest wish was to have a box like that. Love, can I go inside the box and take a look? Gabrielle asked expectantly. Of course, Ralph chuckled. But it's huge inside, and a tour would take a long time. It's too late today, maybe tomorrow. Besides, I still have unfinished business to attend to tonight. What business? Catch the guy who sold Misera to Scamander. She knows Scamander's been captured, and she'll definitely be on her way tonight. Ralph's lips curled into a smile as he whispered, I'm waiting for her. The firewood in the fireplace roared to life. Helen sat by the fireplace, poured herself a glass of whiskey, and felt the alcohol mirror her sour mood. Scamander's a complete idiot, the witch muttered gloomily, staring at the flames. They had just completed the mermaid deal tonight, and Scamander would be captured soon. That guy might betray her to lessen his sentence. Helen had no doubt about it. After all, there was no friendship between them, only a transaction. If it were her, she would abandon anyone to save her own life. Helen gazed at the firelight reflected on the rim of her wine glass and whispered, I must escape tonight. Even drifting at sea would be better than living in fear in her own room. Her destiny must be in her own hands. The witch waved her wand, and the clothes and jewelry scattered throughout the room flew into a small handbag under the power of magic. After packing her belongings, Helen wrapped herself in a black robe woven from rat skin. She stood behind the door, listening quietly through the magical lock for a while. Confirming no one was around, she removed the magical lock she had installed, carefully opened the door, and walked down the dimly lit corridor toward the deck. Leaving already? A voice suddenly rang out from a corner. Madam Helen, you haven't reached the end of this journey yet. Isn't it a bit inappropriate to leave like this? Helen was startled. She turned around, raised her wand, and cast a spell, but the light struck the wall, making a crackling sound. Helen didn't have time to examine it closely. She ran forward, but the voice echoed in her ears again, like a ghost. Missed it, madam. Your technique is rather rough. It doesn't really interest me. It seems you'll have to go back and practice. Who are you? What do you want? Helen snapped angrily. I'm a heartless hunter, completing a hunt. A blurry figure appeared at the end of the corridor, smiling slightly. A hunt, of course, must end with a praise blood. Chapter 273 Within 7 steps, the wand is fast and accurate. Footsteps sounded, the leather creaking against the wooden planks, echoing in the quiet corridor. In the dim light, Helen could make out the newcomer's features. Flowing blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a gentle smile, the witch immediately recognized a handsome young man. Ralph Scamander. Helen narrowed her eyes. She had considered the Aurors coming to capture her, Carlos with a group of sailors to ambush her, or at the very least, some helpful wizard, but she never expected it to be him. In the flickering firelight, Helen's eyes darted around. Ralph smiled and said, You don't need to look anymore, I'm all alone here. Helen immediately relaxed. Just a minor wizard. Perfect, she could do him a quick buck before leaving and kidnap him. Such a handsome young man, whether she imprisoned him for her own amusement or sold him to a rich woman, he could fetch a price no less than that of the mermaid. Helen, however, still asked curiously, What are you doing here? Did Scamander tell you anything? No, Ralph shook his head, patiently explaining, Earlier, I used the disappearance charm to follow Scamander and sneak into your room, witnessing your transaction, the transaction of that mermaid. Impossible, Helen shrieked. She had installed a magical lock on the door. It not only had defensive capabilities but could also detect invisible wizards, even more effectively than a spyglass. If a wizard wearing an invisibility cloak or the disappearance charm entered the room, the magic would be triggered. She had used that to capture many dark wizards. Ralph smiled. He was wearing a modified version of Voldemort's carve, which effectively blocked the detection of magical items. Can you be stronger than the Dark Lord's magic? Helen suddenly raised her wand, shooting out a red beam of light. Ralph tilted his head to the side, easily avoiding the stunning charm. Ralph glanced at the conspicuous hole in the wall in the distance, then looked at the horrified witch and chuckled, Can't you hide her even at this close range? The boy, seeing the utterly embarrassed Mrs. Helen, slowly stepped forward and said gently, I've heard that wands are faster from 7 paces away, and within 7 paces, faster and more accurate. I'll get closer then, and you mustn't disappoint me. Scamander was just a child, Helen reminded herself. He couldn't dodge forever. Just one hit, and the battle would be over. But no matter how Helen shot her spells, Ralph always managed to nimbly dodge and move aside, her spells always grazing his shoulders and arms. Before long, Helen was panting heavily, almost exhausted, sweat streaming down her face, blurring her vision. And each time the boy dodged a spell, he would deliberately shrug and mock her, making Helen tremble uncontrollably, her heart filled with despair. The most exhilarating part of hunting isn't the instant of killing, but the process of toying with the prey. Like a cat catching a mouse, it doesn't kill it quickly, but teases and tortures it repeatedly. Mrs. Helen felt like the prey, and the boy was deliberately tormenting and playing with her. Lost in thought, Helen found herself only a step away from Ralph. He grabbed her arm, shoving her backwards, crashing through the wooden door, and back into her room. Helen staggered and fell to the hard floor. Ralph grabbed her hair with one hand, pulling her head back, while his other hand reached for her throat. Helen's wand was knocked away, and she could only fight Ralph barehanded like a muggle, but her nails scraped against the boy's skin like scraping. Helen was shocked. She then noticed that Scamander's skin had turned silver gray, like dragon scales. What kind of magic was this? Mrs. Helen was choking, struggling to breathe. She punched him repeatedly, but it was like hitting a thick wall. The boy took many punches, seemingly oblivious, while Helen's fists bled. Helen suddenly raised her knee, aiming a fatal blow at Ralph's lower abdomen. But it was as if she had kicked a stone, something harder than anything she had ever seen crack. The bone broke. Helen's leg was broken. Helen was utterly desperate, nearly fainting from the pain, and cried out, "Let me go. I can give you galleons you can't even imagine." Ralph chuckled, "Fool, if I catch you, your galleons will be mine too, won't they?" Helen cried, "What grudge do I hold against you, the mermaid you sold to the mysterious circus? Her name is Miss Era." Ralph grabbed Helen's hands, twisted them sharply, and cleanly broke her arm. "She's my friend." Ralph stood up, dusted himself off, and looked at Helen, who was nearly unconscious. He finally whispered, "And trafficking women and children, they all deserve to die." The news of the mysterious circus owner being taken into custody spread throughout the entire Mayflower. The next morning, last night's performance was a great success. Everyone was still looking forward to the mermaid, but unexpectedly, Scamander was caught. At first, some wizards felt sorry for him, but when they heard that Scamander had released the Cabro dragon, and even a fire dragon, no one sympathized with him anymore. Instead, they wished he would die immediately. Even though Carlos repeatedly assured everyone that this was only a possibility and that a trial by the Aurors was needed, the passengers didn't care. That's human nature. If it doesn't concern them, they can remain indifferent and say a few neutral words, but if their own safety is involved, they can easily go to extremes. People didn't know if Scamander was the murderer, but fear made them assume he was the murderer and that there was danger, so they decided to eliminate the danger. Anyway, no one wanted to be on the same ship as him anymore. Many wizards suggested punishing Scamander according to the laws of the high seas. There were many kinds of punishments on a ship, the most common being whipping. Others included walking on a gangplank, exiled to a desert island, and the dreaded dragging the keel. Dragging the keel involved binding the offending sailor's hands tightly with a long rope and throwing him into the sea. Because the sailor fell so close to the ship, he would be crushed by the hull. Of course, some wizards suggested using cannon fire and canine execution on Scamander. These were clearly wizards from a peninsula in the north. Carlos was very worried. He feared that before even reaching America, Scamander would be killed by the enraged passengers. As for the instigator, Rove, he wasn't very concerned about this matter, or rather, he didn't have time to care. After all his energy was almost completely drained by the half-vessel. This was censored, so I had to modify some of the more extreme content. Sigh. Chapter 274 Me Too. Bang. 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 A series of knocks woke the boy. He rubbed his sleepy eyes, his smooth blonde hair disheveled. "Rov, are you up yet?" A clear, childish voice came from outside the door. "Not yet, I've left your lunch at the door. Get up and eat quickly, or it'll get cold." The girl, stopped at the door, said with a disappointed look, I'll come back to find you later." The knocking stopped, and after a moment, Rov heard footsteps fading away. The boy yawned and slowly sat up. The sun, high in the sky, shone through the curtains, casting a bright red glow on the floor. He had slept longer than expected, but there was nothing he could do. He had been up most of the night, dealing with Scamander and then wrestling with Mrs. Helen. He hadn't been able to get into bed until almost morning and had slept until noon. Heaven knows where Gabrielle, who also slept late, got the energy to come and relentlessly knock on the door from morning until noon. Of course, the little girl always had a good reason for knocking: bringing breakfast, not knowing an English word, bringing a newspaper, asking if Rove was sick, bringing lunch. The most outrageous one was when she ran over to ask if Fleur was in Rove's room because she couldn't find her sister. "I haven't even gotten out of bed yet. How could your sister be in my room?" Sure enough, Rove was getting old, and his energy couldn't keep up with the energetic young girl. The boy, exhausted from all the commotion, wasn't very sleepy. He got up, washed up, and took his lunch. Gabrielle's meal was plentiful: lamb and cheese, mushroom stew with seagulls, a cold salad of chickpeas and turnips, and dessert of chilled blueberries and sweet cream. Just as he was finishing his dessert, the knocking came again, more punctual than an alarm clock. "Love, are you up yet?" Love replied leisurely, picking his teeth. "Not yet." "Okay, but my lunch that I left by the door is gone," the little girl exclaimed in surprise. "Was it stolen?" "I just saw a big spotted dog on the deck. Could it have taken it?" "I'll come back in a bit," Gabrielle called out. "I'll go to the restaurant and bring you a new lunch." "No need, I've already eaten." "Just kidding." Love opened the door and smiled. "Gabrielle, good afternoon. Thank you for the lunch." Gabrielle grinned happily when she saw the boy open the door. "You're finally up. Is there something you need?" Love asked with interest. "You've been knocking on my door since this morning." Gabrielle said somewhat embarrassedly. "I came to see your trunk. We made an appointment last night. Have you forgotten so quickly?" Sorry. Love had indeed forgotten. He said softly, "Come in quickly. I'll show you around." "Great." Gabrielle's face lit up instantly. She walked into the room, both excited and nervous, then turned and ran off. "Hey? Where are you going?" Ralph asked curiously. "To call my sister." Gabrielle slowed her pace, speaking in a sweet voice. "My sister is actually very curious too, and wants to see your baby. She was so excited last night she couldn't sleep well, and she really did call your name in her dream this time." "I'm not lying." Ralph realized that Gabrielle wasn't telling the truth anymore. This little girl had already gone astray in just a few days. Who corrupted her? It certainly wasn't Ralph, since he never lied. It seemed the Mayflower's feng shui was really bad. Gabrielle quickly pulled Fleur over, and Ralph opened the box and placed it on the ground. Gabrielle excitedly moved closer, the little girl bending over, sticking her bottom out, and leaning her head down beside the box. The position was so perfect that Ralph couldn't resist lifting his foot and gently kicking the girl's bottom, sending her tumbling inside. Ralph then looked at Fleur, whose face paled. She took a half step back, raising an eyebrow and saying, "No, don't even think about it." Ralph was both amused and exasperated, gracefully extending his hand and saying, "Get down now, I won't kick you." Fleur glanced at Ralph warily, and seeing him take a step back, she cautiously walked to the box, not forgetting to cover her buttocks. However, a strong force came from behind, and Ralph pushed her down. "Go." Ralph also jumped off the box, landing smoothly. The Fleur sisters didn't bother him, but stared blankly at the unfamiliar room. The entire wooden house was several times larger than before, one wall lined with bookshelves and boxes filled with many magic books. The shelves on the other wall were filled with various ointments, herbs, and potions. The strange tools, handcuffs, leg irons, whips, and so on, had been moved elsewhere by Sherry, making the room seem less eerie. Golden light streamed in through the round, yellow-tinted windows with their wavy patterns, making the room warm and inviting. Ralph sat at the table, which Sherry had always tidied, but it was already somewhat messy after only a few days of her absence. Gabrielle picked up a pair of glasses from the table, asking curiously, "What's this?" "Magic glasses to block the basilisk's pupils," Ralph explained. Looking directly into a basilisk's eyes would be fatal, and the basilisk in the secret chamber was already blind and posed no danger, but the newly hatched basilisk would eventually grow up. Ralph decided to create an alchemical artifact. Wearing these glasses would allow him to look directly into the basilisk's pupils. Of course, he didn't have the ability to design such an alchemical artifact, but it wasn't too difficult for Nico. "You still have basilisks here?" Fleur asked, shocked. "Only two," Ralph said modestly, waving his hand. Fleur was speechless. Europe hadn't seen a basilisk in centuries, and you have two in one box? You think that's not enough? Gabrielle was quickly drawn to the photos on the wall. Besides several group photos, there were many individual pictures. The little girl looked around, pointing to the prettiest girl with a ponytail, and asked curiously, "Rover, who's this?" Fleur also looked at the beautiful red-haired girl. "Shirley, my classmate," Rover introduced, "and also my assistant. The girl with messy hair next to her is Hermione," Rover said softly, "Hogwarts' smartest student." The boy then pointed to the short, chubby boy beside him. "That's Neville, a herbalism genius, and a bit of swordsmanship talent, though he doesn't even dare to hold a kitchen knife now. That's my sister Marjorie." Rover finally pointed to the witch by the bedside. "She's studying at Ivermony School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, and will graduate next year." He wondered if Marjorie would come to pick him up when he arrived in America, but Rover at least wanted to see that crazy woman. Ralph led the two on a tour, finally stopping at a wooden door and pulling the brass knocker shaped like a griffin. Fleur and Gabrielle stepped out of the room, their faces filled with astonishment at the scene before them. Ahead lay a vast forest, with rugged gray rock hills to the left and a gently sloping, flat plain stretching endlessly to the right. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, a babbling brook murmured, and the call of a snowy owl echoed in the sky. From a nearby lake, the song of a mermaid resonated, her voice melodious and beautiful, sometimes soft and gentle, sometimes soaring, like heavenly music. Fleur stared intently for a long time before suddenly understanding why her mother had been so fixated on Newt Scamander's trunk. She felt the same way. Chapter 275 Misera's Original Fish Scales? After taking Fleur and Gabriel for a short walk, Rove gave them a flying broomstick, letting the sisters drive around. With the invisible beast following them, there wouldn't be any major safety issues. The boy, carrying a box alone, quickly arrived at the lakeside, where a beautiful golden mermaid was singing in the center. Rove had just sat cross-legged under a chestnut tree when Miss Alice swam over, her graceful figure and slender tail shimmering golden in the water. Not far from the boy, Miss Alice stopped, her upper body emerging from the water, revealing a long blue seaweed robe and half of her breast, her golden hair covered by an exquisite silver hairnet inlaid with deep purple gemstones. Miss Alice's clothes and gemstones had been taken by Helen, but Rove returned them to her after catching the woman. "What were you singing just now?" Rove asked curiously. "I learned a song from my mother when I was little," Misera told the boy, "a song praising a warrior who rescued a mermaid princess from a sea monster and slew it." "Is it nice?" "It's very nice," the boy smiled. "Ruff, you are the warrior in the song." Misera stared at the boy and said seriously, "You rescued me from the circus and did what the song says. That being said, you still need to be careful in the future." Ruff casually broke off a foxtail grass and said softly, "Life is not like a song. In real life, it is often the monster that wins, kills the warrior, and captures the princess." The boy held the foxtail grass and pointed to the stiff cabro dragon not far away, saying, "It also wanted to save you, but failed, and was blocked by me. This monster, this is the reality for most of the time." Misera seemed thoughtful. She always felt that Ruff was too composed for a boy, and the tone of his voice when he spoke to her was as if he were her father. But the girl not only disliked it, but actually liked it very much. "Is it dead?" "No, it's just under my spell." "A potion made from mandrake will do the trick," Ralph asked curiously. "How did you meet this guy?" The cabro dragon lived in Canada, and he was curious why this creature was in the Atlantic and trying to protect Misera. The girl spun in the water, stirring the cold surface. "You know, I was searching for that mysterious island in the North Sea." Ralph nodded slightly. Misera was a two-tailed mermaid, and according to her, her family was cursed with grayscale. Misera was searching for the mysterious island, trying to break the curse with a fountain of good fortune on it. "I searched the North Sea for a long time without finding the island, so I continued on, crossing Greenland, and arrived in Canada, where I encountered a group of cabro dragons," Misera said softly. "I saved this guy, and it followed me all the way back to the North Sea. It can track my scent, which is how it found the Mayflower." Ralph suddenly understood. Although Europe and North America appear far apart on a map, separated by the Atlantic Ocean, they are actually quite close. Starting from Iceland, crossing Greenland, one can reach Canada. In fact, Greenland politically belongs to Denmark, but geographically it is part of North America. Similarly, Columbus wasn't the first European to discover the New World. As early as 1000 AD, Vikings sailed westward through Iceland and Greenland, reaching a desolate, snow-covered land they named Slateland, which later became Baffin Island in Canada. However, these Vikings were unlucky. Their landing site was unsuitable, and unlike their later predecessors, they didn't use a viral warfare method, smallpox. Therefore, they were driven back by the local natives. Suddenly, Ralph picked up a box from behind him, opened the lid, and asked, "Myrcella, what are you going to do with this guy?" Myrcella's eyes were glazed. After being captured by Helen, she had been trapped in this box for several days. In her most desperate moments, she had even considered suicide. Now, the situation had reversed. Helen was imprisoned inside. "I'm curious, how did she know I'd be passing through there and lay in ambush?" Myrcella asked. "I gave Helen a truth serum. She said she bribed some mermaids from the Black Lake Mermaid tribe," Rove explained. "Those mermaids told her about your departure and the route you took, which allowed her to capture you." "I see." Myrcella was somewhat dejected. She hadn't expected to be betrayed by her own kind. "What do you plan to do with her?" "I want to take her back to my tribe." Myrcella looked into the boy's eyes and said, "My father will punish her. The British Ministry of Magic doesn't have the death penalty. Criminals are usually imprisoned in Azkaban." Rove asked curiously, "Is that the case with your mermaid tribe? It won't just be putting her in jail for 12 or 13 years and then deporting her, will it?" "No." Myrcella closed her eyes and shook her head. "She will be subjected to fish torture." "No." Helen suddenly screamed. She knew about fish torture. It involved nailing the victim to a rock, then sinking them into the sea, where Grindelwald would rip out their entrails, allowing piranhas to devour their bodies until death. Helen, sitting at the bottom of the box, looked up at Ralph and pleaded, "Mr. Scamander, I have so many galleons. I've hidden them in different vaults, and I've entrusted the keys to other people. They only recognize me. I'll go get them for you. All those galleons are yours. I just beg you to spare my life." "Do you think I'll believe you?" Ralph scoffed. "I absolutely did not lie to you," Helen shouted. "This concerns my life. How could I possibly lie to you? Why does the Niffler like shiny things?" The boy chuckled disdainfully. "It's in its nature. For someone like you, lying is as natural as breathing." "Of course, even if you didn't lie, I wouldn't risk letting you get any keys," Ralph said dismissively. "People can never earn galleons beyond their understanding and abilities. Even if they earn them by luck, they'll have to give them back by their own efforts. I don't want to be tricked by you and locked up in a box." Myrcella looked at Ralph with reverence. Hearing that the boy was unwilling to spare her, Helen suddenly cursed, her tone so fierce it seemed to ignite the air. Ralph raised his wand, and a spell struck Helen squarely in the cheek, knocking her to the ground with a thud. A water arrow shot up from the lake, piercing straight through Helen with a thud, and embedded itself firmly in the wall of the cage. Helen let out a painful groan, cold sweat beading on her forehead. With her struggle, her wounds tore open, and blood gushed forth. "This witch is cunning," Ralph said calmly. "I'll give her a potion soon, enough to keep her unconscious for a while, so you can safely return to your tribe." "Aren't you coming back with me?" Myrcella hurriedly asked. "Ralph, you saved me. Go to my homeland. My father will surely repay you and give you anything you want." "I'll definitely go next time," Ralph smiled. "The Mayflower won't eat her around the Mediterranean. We'll have to separate up ahead, otherwise you'll have to cross the entire Atlantic to get home." Myrcella let out a silent sigh of disappointment. She paused for a moment, then raised her hand. A golden scale adorned her palm. "Rov, this is for you, as a reward for saving me." Rov took the golden scale. It was warm, almost alive, shimmering with a golden light, brighter than gold itself. Myrcella blushed and said, "This is a golden scale peeled from my body, very precious. I will treasure it forever," Rov promised. Myrcella smiled. "It has special magic. If you hold it in your mouth, you can breathe underwater. This scale has also been soaked in bodily fluids, containing the scent of a mermaid. As long as you are in the ocean, I can find you." "Bodily fluids?" Rov was stunned. This couldn't possibly be the original scale, could it? Thanks to the generous donor. Just love waiting in the water for the donation. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.